Live now.
All right, thank you. All right, this is Brad Borum with the commission staff. Hopefully everything will work better this time. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have YouTube reserved for 12 hours, and for some reason it kicked us out. So once that happens, you have to go back and get a new YouTube link and everything else and start all over. So hopefully we won't have any problems for the remainder of the afternoon. We even took advantage of the YouTube mess to actually get my computer so it was working a little bit better here. So to the extent that I'm having problems, it's going to be all because of me, not my computer. So we will get started here. One thing I do want to say is, and I think this has also been posted on our website, is participation in this webinar has qualified for CLEs so the attorney can go out there and it's my understanding within the 30 days and apply to have these credits. So we just got that through, I think, on Friday. So again, I believe more information has been posted to the website on that. Now we are ready to dive into the next agenda item, which is the implications of a changing resource mix. And both MISO and PJM will be speaking. The first speaker will be Melissa Seymour, if I have that right, from the MISO. Then then it will be Fallon from the PJM, if I pronounced his name correctly. And I will let each speaker briefly introduce themselves, give a little bit of their background, and then we can dive into their presentation. We'll try to have the same structure here. Now that my computer has been worked on a little bit, hopefully the questions in the chat box for YouTube will work better, and that'll be a little more seamless. And for those of you who have difficulties with that, because you have to have a Google account apparently to use that chat feature, you can still send your questions directly to Bob Pauley, and he will be looking at the emails just in case questions come in that way. So again, we are dealing with the implications of a changing resource mix, and I will turn it over to Melissa Seymour.
Well, thank you, Brad. This is Melissa Seymour, and again, I work at MISO. I am the regional executive for MISO Central Region. So MISO, of course, operates in 15 states. So I work in and around 6 states around Indiana, or 5 states in and around Indiana. So Indiana is one of the states that I work with. We work with our members there and also regulatory bodies to work through issues and problems and MISO strategy. So I've been there about 6.5 years, but I've been in the industry for probably now more than 28 years. So in various capacities in the both in regulated utilities, in independent power producers, and also for a government agency working in the power world. So I've been in and around the industry for quite a long time. So today, as Brad mentioned, I'm going to spend some time talking about some of the changes that are going on in MISO's resource mix. And what we're doing about it, because we've been spending a lot of time in our stakeholder processes working towards changes that we have to make on the markets and operations of our system to make sure that we're ready for these changing resource mix. So this is something that we've been working through. If you're participating in our stakeholder processes, you probably touched on one of the items that I'm going to focus on today, which is the resource availability and need items that we've been addressing mostly at our RASC or Resource Adequacy Subcommittee and our market subcommittees. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about those. But first, I want to give you some context for how we're seeing this big picture. So if you can move to the next slide. we've named the process that we're using to evaluate all these changes the reliability imperative. So as we mentioned, there's a lot of fleet changes that are going on in our system. Our members are making different decisions about what they want their fuel mix to be, and I'm going to show you that in a moment, what we're seeing from our members as far as fuel mix in the future. And it's really resulting in a lot of diversity and volatility on our grid. So we have developed a number of work streams to make sure that we are providing that value to our members and creating value for our members against all of this, against the changes that we're seeing. And so we've named the initiative of coordinating the collection of efforts that we're talking about related to reliability as the reliability imperative, which you can see here in the middle of the page. And so what you're seeing around there are some of the initiatives and things that we're looking at as part of the reliability imperative. These should look familiar to you if you're participating in our stakeholder process, because they are things that we're talking about. For example, long-range transmission planning or transmission planning. We just started to talk about at the Planning Advisory Committee meeting that we just held in August. So we're starting to kick off the efforts related to our long-range transmission planning process. Market design redefinition, as we call it, is what we're really going to focus on today. And that is our resource availability and need initiatives, our reliability criteria, and any new products that we're going to come up with will be in that area. Grid technology integration. This is an important component of our reliability imperative as we see more renewables coming online, more storage, and new products. Operations, processes, and tools. We are looking at what we call operations of the future, which we kicked off at our reliability subcommittee. We've also talked about some market system enhancements that we've been doing to make sure that our systems are going to be able to handle all the changes that we're going to talk about today. So those are some of the things. And then value creation and measurement. That's always what we need to be doing, because MISO, of course, is a voluntary member-driven organization. So as we create more value or as we discuss value, we want to make sure that we can measure it and show that value to our members. So next slide, please. So I wanted to start off showing you a little bit about what our members have been up to over the last several years. So this is actually a chart that shows you all the 4 of our members' actual fleets. So today you can see how the resource fleets are made up. In today's world, if you actually looked at this in 2005, you would see a lot more coal in most of these fleets, as we've seen a lot of retirements, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But you can see here that even now our fleets are changing towards a lot of gas. We're seeing more renewables on our fleet. But you can see here, based on their integrated resource plans and announcements they've made, how they're changing. In 2030, you'll definitely see that some of them are moving toward a lot more gas. We see a lot of renewables on the system. You'll see one of them has 65%, 55%. This has basically been driven by folks, their members and their customers, driving them to a cleaner portfolio. So we've seen a lot of changes in the portfolio over the last several years. We anticipate seeing even more to 2030, and we've got to be ready as MISO to address the integration challenges, the operational flexibility that we're going to need, and some of the to make sure that each of these members, as diverse as they can be, can all implement the portfolios that they have that they want to implement. So our job is to facilitate them being able to drive their strategies and to be able to make sure we have market mechanisms and resource adequacy structures in place and transmission available for them to be able to facilitate these changes. So that's kind of what this slide represents. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what's been happening through time. In 2005, starting in 2005, to the left, you'll see the retirement situation that we've had since 2005. So, in recent years, we've seen changes, and we just saw that to our resource fleet. Our retirements have been driven largely by increases in environmental regulations. Our low natural gas prices and growing interest really in renewable generation. And so states, utilities, and consumers are really embracing that decarbonization as we see coal retirements and some gas additions occur. So you'll see here on the left-hand side of our pie chart, you'll see that increase in coal retirements and some older gas units as we've progressed. We've had about 24 gigawatts of retirement since 2005. You can see from the chart at the top, these are the approved generator retirements that we've seen that's resulting in that chart from 2010 through 2020. Primarily, you can see coal, but in 2013, we saw some older gas units. And then we see here, based on what we've been told or what we've heard from IRPs, our forecasted retirements. And so from 2020 through 2039, you can see more coal we see retiring, a little more gas units. We have some nuclear plants. So all of these systems of traditional resources that have been used to balance our system all along are retiring. And what we see replacing it is a lot of renewable generation that has different characteristics to the system that we need to be able to utilize, but also be able to ensure that some of this traditional generation that we have can actually help us in providing stability and support and voltage for some of the uncertainty and volatility that we'll be having in the future. So these are the things that MISO has been thinking about as we've been thinking about the changes to our resource portfolio. Next slide, please. So it kind of starts with resource adequacy. Our resource adequacy construct, I think you talked about earlier today, is an annual construct, and it really sets the reserve margin for the fleet, and our load-serving entities have to meet those reserve margins. It's been primarily based on summer peak, as we've had, as that's been traditional, and a 1 day in 10 sort of loss of load expectation analysis. And we're seeing that those things that we traditionally did may not be sufficient as we move into this new world. So we've looked at it from first a resource planning, lens, and the current deficiencies and insufficiencies we see are that the current requirements may not incent members in our current resource adequacy construct to share, to bring their share of resources and required capabilities to the pool. So what that means is that resource pool that we've had that has been so diverse and we've had in excess will continue to start to erode. And we might have more tight operating conditions because we may not have the right capabilities that we need as we see the proliferation of changes to the portfolio being primarily renewables. And those are things like voltage and ramp capability and stability that we're going to need those capabilities going forward. So as we see retirements and maybe not the same type of replacements, we need to keep those in mind as we think of resource adequacy and resource planning going forward. And then reliability needs. So I talked about our current reserve margin analysis, and what it doesn't reflect is variations in production or maybe seasonal risks. So it does the summer peak months. We see that we do the loss of load 1 day in 10 on the summer peak months, but that doesn't necessarily assure that we see resources available at the right time with the right capabilities in day ahead in real time, because we're seeing more issues in the off-peak periods with our resources available, and issues on our system maybe in the winter or in the spring and fall. And so we need to make sure that we account in our reserve margin analysis and some of these seasonal risk factors that we're seeing that are now evolving as our resources get more in line with our load. So as we get closer to our planning reserve margin and we don't have all that excess, we're seeing more times of more tight operating conditions. And then finally, resource availability. We need to make sure that we're looking at and accurately reflecting what we expect folks to be able to bring in the real time and accredit those resources correctly. Again, we've seen an increase in a number of emergency events due to scarcity of these available resources. So we need to make sure that we're giving the proper credit in the resource adequacy timeframe to resources that can actually be available when we need them in the real time, so that we don't run into some of the system conditions that we've been seeing occurring throughout the year. So these are really some of the things that we have been thinking through as we work through our stakeholder meetings and discussions on our resource availability and need as those things go forward. And so the next slide basically shows you some of the things that we're going to be doing in the near term to address what we're seeing some of those needs and deficiencies are. And we define them under identifying reliability needs first, and then we look at the planning horizon, which is really the resource adequacy horizon, and the operating horizon. You can see here we're focused on our near term, so 2020, 2021 focus. And we really believe these priorities that we're showing you today are the correct focus to enhance reliability in the near term, while we continue to look at what we need to do in the longer term. If we take into the account these changes, it really provides us directionally the correct path to go down for our diverse resource mix and our variability across our resources. And it'll really enhance our availability, visibility, and flexibility that we've been desiring. And if you've read our MISO Forward report, that we highlighted in that report as a real need as our system changes going forward. So under identifying reliability needs, we think the need is really to have an analytic method to define the reliability criteria. So identify what system reliability needs in addition to that peak hour in the summer that we need. So we're really looking at 24/7 risk, not just our peak hour. So not just our summer peak period that is important. And so we've been spending some time in a lot of time in the stakeholder processes in our resource adequacy system subcommittee, so our RASC meeting, talking about defining those system reliability needs and capabilities. What do we actually want from the system? What are some of the things that we're going to need if we increase the penetration of renewables to 30 or 40%? You may have heard about our RIA study, which is a study that we've been looking at different penetrations of renewables that might impact our system. And some of those reliability needs and capabilities have been identified as part of that process, like ramp, like voltage support. So some of those things that as our system changes and we see more renewables entering our system that we're going to need. So we're focused on that under identify reliability needs. In the planning horizon, so this is really the resource adequacy horizon, we're defining planning constructs that complement. Remember, the states have the primary and members have the primary role in resource adequacy. So we know that, and we want to complement that as part of our construct. So we think we have to partner with stakeholders, members, and states to require better information and informing planning decisions and investment decisions. So we see this as a partnership with our states and our members because they're the ones with the responsibility to maintain that resource adequacy. So we've been looking at things like sub-annual planning. So should we be looking at the seasonal risks that I talked about earlier that we've been feeling in real time over the past several years? And we're looking at PRA reform. Should we be reforming the way we do resource adequacy, the foundation of how we procure resources 6 weeks ahead of the planning year? Is there changes that we can make there? And then finally, resource accreditation has been something we've been talking about with stakeholders, where we want to make sure that we have the proper credit, that we're providing resources so they are there and available when we need them in real time and in the day ahead. Finally, in the operating horizon, we've been trying to improve pricing of our existing products and developing the processes and tools and products we need. So we need to make sure that our market prices actually reflect what is going on the system. If we're having an emergency or we're having a scarce resource situation, we need to make sure that our prices reflect that. So we've been addressing emergency and scarcity pricing reforms in our market subcommittee. Recently, we've been focused on the emergency part of that pricing reform, but we're about to start talking about scarcity. So should we be pricing at those times when we have, so right now we price pretty much on average cost when we take a when we take an action on the system, it lowers the price, even though you see issues on the system still occurring. So we need to make sure we're getting the prices right so that our generators have the right incentive to remain online and to come online when we're in an emergency situation or a scarcity information situation. So again, we're talking about this at our market subcommittee and hope to make some progress in the next year. So finally, the last slide shows you a little bit about the actual initiatives that we're undertaking related to the 2021 time period. Some of these have been complete. So in the planning horizon, we just received FERC approval for the load modifying resource accreditation, and we filed the installed capacity deliverability, both for thermal and renewables. We are in the process of responding to a deficiency notice from FERC related to that. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to move on that after that deficiency notice is resolved. Again, on the needs side, we've been defining the system reliability needs and capabilities. In fact, we had a white paper that was just published yesterday related to some of the work we've been doing with the stakeholders around what those needs and capabilities are. So you should probably, if you haven't already, which you probably haven't since it came out yesterday, it might be something that you look at. Subannual planning and planning resource auction reforms are something we're hoping to get through. We're starting to talk about. We've been talking about what we need and what we see, and some of the analysis around that. And I think we're headed toward trying to figure out what kind of solutions that we could propose that stakeholders can respond to. Same with resource accreditation. So these are initiatives that we're hoping to make filings at I think Q2 of 2021. And then scarcity emergency pricing. We've been talking mostly about emergency pricing, and we're hoping to make a filing about emergency pricing more in the near term, and maybe scarcity pricing in Q2 of 2021. We also have a multi-day operating margin forecast enhancements. This is what you do and what you provide to folks, especially coal units, so that they know what to expect 5 days in advance of an operating, so they can make decisions about whether they want to bring on their or maintain their coal fleet or bring it online. So we're hoping to make some enhancements through time to that. So these are a lot of initiatives, like I said, that we have that are moving through the stakeholder process today. So if you're interested, you can follow those on through our stakeholder process. And again, most of these have a 2021 date for a FERC filing that we're hopeful that we can get these implemented in the short term while we still look at our long-term enhancements. So with that, I'm done with my presentation, but I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
I'm not seeing any questions right now, but can you stay on the line?
I will.
And we'll do the PJM presentation, and then hopefully we'll have questions for both of you by then.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, go ahead, Tom.
Oh, okay. Hello, everybody. This is Tom Fallon from PJM. If I could just get confirmation that folks hear me. Okay,
yes,
great. It's coming through. Okay. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this afternoon on this panel. You know, the changing resource mix in PJM has actually been a subject of quite a bit of analysis of our group in the last couple of years. So I'll be sharing with you some of those analysis results. Just by way of background, again, I'm Tom Fallon. I'm the Director of Resource Adequacy Planning at PJM. So I'm in the planning division. Our primary mission is to keep the lights on now and in the future. Our planning horizon is 1 to 15 years out. My particular department, I guess, has kind of three main functions. The first one is to develop a long-term load forecast out to 15 years. It's used in both our capacity auction and then for all of our planning studies. Our second department function is to kind of track generator performance through the NERC GAD system, generator attribute data system. And then finally, another function is to perform the LOLP studies, or the loss of load probability studies. That's sort of a probabilistic annual study that we perform each year that comes up with the required reserve margin that is then used in the capacity market. So as you can see, my background is in planning. So as you will soon discover, the focus of all my slides here is really on the planning aspects of the changing fuel mix. However, at the very end, I do have a couple slides to comment on some capacity market rule changes that we're contemplating to kind of better accommodate wind and solar and hybrid and energy storage in the capacity market. So I am going to try to call up my slides here.
Excuse me, Tom. Hey,
Yeah.
if you're not speaking right now, can you mute your line? People on the WebEx. So go ahead, Tom. Sorry for that.
Okay, Brad, I'm actually going to try to recruit your help. Could you call up my slides maybe on your screen to have on the WebEx and on YouTube? Okay, great. Thanks very much. If you could advance to slide 2, please, Brad. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so this is just a snapshot of the current fuel mix in PJM as of December 31st of last year. As you can see, our fuel mix is kind of dominated by three fuels, essentially coal, natural gas, and nuclear. Renewable resources, kind of hydro and wind, there at the top are kind of the largest contribution to that. I would point out that this fuel mix has changed quite a bit in the last 5 to 10 years. If you had taken this snapshot, say 5 or even 10 years ago, coal would have been a much larger component, probably about 75,000 megawatts of coal, and natural gas would have been much smaller. We've seen a very large influx of natural gas over the last 5 years. PJM kind of sits right on top of Marcellus Shale. So with all the fracking advancements of the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a very large influx of natural gas. All the other fuels have kind of held steady with sort of a steady increase in the renewables. But overall, I think as of now, we sort of have a pretty well-balanced fuel mix. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Just as a point of curiosity, this is the fuel mix of the portion of Indiana that is in PJM. So obviously, it's quite a bit different from the PJM overall fuel mix. The Indiana share is kind of dominated by coal and then natural gas. I did find it interesting that the third most common fuel in Indiana is wind generation. Looks like a total of about 6,300 megawatts of PJM capacity in Indiana. I think the Indiana load is about 3,700 megawatts. It's in PJM. So as you can see, the PJM portion of Indiana is quite long in generation. Next slide, please. Okay, here's also a snapshot of our current fuel mix, but it's based on energy as opposed to installed capacity. So it's going to be slightly different. Obviously, the base load units are going to be producing more megawatt hours per year. So again, the primary supply of electricity is from those three main fuel sources, but then we sort of cut out the 5.6% slice of the pie there that are renewable resources. You can see that wind is a pretty significant portion of that slice, again, based on energy. And then solar is only 0.3%, but that is the one that we see growing the most. So this, again, is just kind of the same snapshot of today, just what we see in terms of energy each year. Next slide, please. Okay, so all the previous slides were what we have iron in the ground today. This is a snapshot of our generation interconnection queue, again, as of the last day of last year. I find this remarkable in that it has changed quite a bit, this queue data. I think the first point that really jumps out at me, at least, is the large red portion, which is solar queue projects. It's almost 36,000 megawatts of solar. And I would point out that is their capacity value. So the nameplate value would be even greater than that. So we have seen a very large increase in the solar projects that have come into the queue, probably driven by renewable portfolio standards and various state initiatives. Natural gas is still a significant chunk of this graph has also shifted within the last 5 years. As solar has grown a lot, natural gas has come down a little bit. I do think it's interesting to point out that storage over there on the right and wind are actually also significant portion of those queue projects. It's probably important to point out that historically only about 10% of the megawatts or of the projects in the queue have eventually come online. So obviously there are projects then will actually be installed, usually about 10%. But this change in the queue project mix has certainly caught the attention of the PJM planners. Move on to the next slide, please. Okay, just a final comment on the fuel mix. In PJM, demand resources for interruptible load is actually treated on the supply side. In our capacity auction, it offers in as supply. So it is also a very important resource we have. I know PJM operators certainly rely on DR quite a bit during emergency conditions. Graph, I guess going way back to 2003, the growth of DR. Now, obviously, we had a much smaller footprint back in 2003, but we have seen significant increases in demand response up to almost 12,000 megawatts. It's tailed off a little bit in the last 4 or 5 years. I think that is probably due to the implementation of capacity performance rules about 3 or 4 years ago, where in the capacity market now, all resources must be available 12 months a year. So any standalone demand response program that's only available in the summer would no longer be eligible to offer into our capacity market. And again, this bar graph is only showing the capacity market demand resources. I would point out, though, that summer-only interruptible load still has a couple of other options. They can participate in our peak shaving program, or they could also be part of price-responsive demand. So there are other avenues for interruptible load to participate in our markets. So I think this bar graph in recent years actually kind of understates by maybe 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts the actual amount of demand response in PJM. But my point here, it is a pretty significant portion of our load. I'd say between 5 and 8% of the PJM total load is interruptible. Next slide, please. Okay, so having seen those changes in the fuel mix and then the kind of projects that are in the interconnection queue, I should probably first state up front that in terms of projected reserve margins, PJM appears to be sufficient for the next 5 to 10 years. If you just take a look at our essentially flat demand growth, we're growing at maybe 0.4% a year, if that. The amount of demand response the iron in the ground capacity minus announced retirements, if we recognize external sales and purchases, and then if we look at the interconnection queue, the expected influx of new capacity, PJM's projecting like 25% reserves or greater for each of the next 10 years. So our reserve requirement is usually about 15%. So in terms of sheer megawatts, we appear to be sufficient for the foreseeable future. Our concern, though, of course, is kind of the composition of those reserves. Is PJM perhaps becoming overly reliant on gas units and therefore gas pipeline interruptions, or with the increased penetration of intermittence or energy storage, could that lead to some other reliability problems? So to try to answer that question, we've launched a couple of studies in the last 2 years. One is sort of a qualitative approach I'll talk about briefly, and then we followed that with a much more rigorous quantitative approach that actually makes a lot of system reliability runs to project, how many hours per year might PJM face a load shed event if certain extreme conditions happen simultaneously. So on the qualitative approach, if you could move to the next slide, please. Okay, this is kind of a busy slide, so let me try to explain the column headings here. If you turn your head 90 degrees and kind of read across the column headings, these are all the generator attributes such as voltage control, ramping, load following, black start capability that are really essential to maintain reliability. So we have about 8 or 10 of those going across the top, and then each of those rows down there is a fuel mix. So then we just evaluate the ability of each fuel type to provide those essential reliability attributes. And we kind of adopted the old consumer report convention, if people remember. If the fuel type performs or supplies that attribute well, it has a full circle, partially a half circle, or not at a blank circle. So it's just sort of a qualitative measure of how well each of those fuel types in those rows supplies each of those attributes. So just as an example for hydro, on the top row there, it performs very well on a lot of the ramping capability and all. However, it's going to fall short on the minimum fuel. It may be fuel limited due to river flow, maybe drought conditions, or if it's pump storage hydro, it only has a certain amount of a reservoir it can draw from. And then on the right there, the environmental restrictions is kind of half filled in because hydro may be facing some of those restrictions. So all we did was go through each fuel type, assign that rating as to how they perform. We then took the current portfolio of PJM, given the fuel mix we have, and combined all those indexes into a single composite reliability index that we had in 2018, given the fuel mix we had in 2018. It was determined we had a reliable system in 2018. We satisfied all the applicable NERC criteria. So we want to make sure we retain that going forward. And then that composite reliability index was set to a value of 1.0. So now if you could move to the next slide. Okay, we essentially concluded the fleet performed well in terms of meeting all those generator attributes in 2018, but what might the future fuel mix look like and what would its CRI be, its composite reliability index? So all of those vertical bars, each one of them is a fuel portfolio. We varied it, and for each of those potential fuel portfolios, we computed a CRI, a composite reliability index for each of those portfolios. We then ordered them from left to right, from the lowest CRI up to the highest CRI. So that's the purple line there in the middle. The vertical axis on the right is the CRI axis. So we would hope to have portfolios that have a CRI at 1.0 or above. You can see by the various colors how we chose to vary the fuels. The solid gray bar at the top, really, we kept constant oil, hydro, storage, and diesel fuel mix. We kept that constant from 2018 forward. And then all the other fuel mixes, we just assumed accelerated retirements, maybe of nuclear or coal, replace that with wind or solar or oil. So I think some general conclusions that you can draw from this, and I don't think any of them are surprising, is that if solar and wind become a larger component, like over on the left there, you have yellow is wind. As that becomes larger, your composite reliability index tends to be lower. If you retain a fair amount of nuclear and coal, and even with natural gas, which is the blue area, with that expanding, you tend to perform better in the CRI. I think on the far right, we show that blue can get rather large, maybe 80% of the mix being natural gas, and we would still, based on this rather superficial analysis, be okay in terms of in terms of providing all the reliability attributes. So this is a graph we update each year. We also, I think, as folks probably know, the PJM capacity auction is cleared 3 years in advance. So as soon as we have a cleared portfolio, we compute the CRI, composite reliability index of that portfolio. We have been able to verify that all the cleared portfolios are 1.0 or above. So at least for the foreseeable future, in terms of providing those essential reliability attributes a couple of slides ago, we seem to be fine. But again, we sort of have an idea as to what kind of shift in the fuel could tend to move us to the left on this graph, and therefore have to re-examine if we are reliable in terms of the operational reliability. So that was kind of the quick, simple analysis. If you could move to the next slide. Okay, after that, we decided to drill down a lot more and try to actually compute what the LOLP, or loss of load probability, might look like if you're given really extreme scenarios. So on this slide are the very we scenarios from. We examined the winter load because that's where we have seen fuel interruption problems. You can see there the third column from the left. We examined both a typical 50-50 winter with a peak of 135,000 megawatts, and then we looked at an extreme winter, or 95.5, which is a 1 in 20-year load level. We did hourly analysis for a 14-day cold snap. We looked at things such as environments where instead of having projected 28% reserves, what if PJM got all the way down to its required margin of only 15.8% reserves? In the middle there, we looked at the availability of gas that has non-firm contracts. And let's just say either none of that gas was able to run, that's the 0% availability, or 62.5% was able to run. We varied the refueling at various oil stations, whether it was limited or just moderate. And then the big impact, of course, was we assumed, I think, 4 different gas pipeline disruptions, up to 4 interstate gas pipelines being unavailable. We considered whether they were a radial feed or a parallel feed, where you would have some redundant supply. And then finally, we varied the forced outages from sort of an average PJM 7% of the thermal units to really the extreme forced outage rates that we saw. If you go back about 5 years ago, we had a polar vortex roll through PJM in which the forced outage rates on the system hit about 22%. There were a lot of common mode outages where fuel was unable to get through. So if you mix up all these various scenarios, you end up with 324 combinations. So on the next slide, we have the results of those studies. Okay, so what's on this slide, we're only looking at the announced retirement model. The right-hand side, you'll see the operational steps in that legend on the right from normal operations down to firm load shed. So we don't want to see any of that purple or magenta color there. As you can see from this, the cells on this chart, each one represents an individual scenario. We're not seeing anything worse than a reserve shortage. That's about the most extreme emergency procedure. So we can conclude from this slide that if only the announced retirements happen, and even, for instance, the bottom right-hand cell is really the most extreme case. You're dealing with a 95.5 winter once every 20 years, extremely cold condition. You're assuming that PJM dispatches based on purely economics, so it doesn't conserve the more expensive backup fuel maybe to run during critical hours. We also have 4 pipes out. The gas, it's limited refueling on all the oil units. So really the most extreme unlikely scenario, as long as we're only dealing with the announced retirements, PJM seems to be fine, maybe experience some reserve shortages, but again, no firm load shedding. So on the next slide, please. Okay, so on this slide now, we've taken the escalated retirement models. So instead of assuming PJM has 28% reserves, we made a run at 21% reserves and then at 15.8% reserves, because that's the requirement. So actually, if you could page down one more, Brad, I think. Okay, yeah, just to focus on the top 4 rows in this. These are all the cases in which we're assuming we're experiencing a typical winter. Okay, it's a 50-50 load condition. Under all those conditions, if you were to have an retirement, zero availability from all the gas units that have non-firm supply, and you have all those pipeline disruptions where 4 pipelines are out, we're still essentially seeing almost always normal operations, one case where demand response is needed. But in general, even under an escalated retirement model, as long as you're dealing with a typical winter, we seem to avoid load shed. Okay, page down one more. Okay, so now to focus on the bottom half, we decided to really push the scenarios and the combination to see, at what point would PJM potentially face some load shed events. So that's what's kind of shown in pink or in magenta here. Any one of those cells and the number inside the cell is the number of hours in which PJM would have to shed load. So just for instance, the worst case scenario is that 83 hours there on the far right, of load shed. But remember, for that to happen, you would have to be dealing with a 1 in 20 winter condition, 4 interstate pipelines out, PJM dispatching based on economics, limited refueling, and no energy coming from non-firm gas. So a really extraordinary set of conditions. If you could hit page down again, please. Kind of like this slide because it shows what mitigating steps could be used to reduce the hours of load shed. So if instead we just had moderate refueling at the very bottom there of oil units rather than limited, everything else the same, the number of hours of load shed would be reduced from 83 down to 22. Then if you could hit page down one more. And the other change there is if our dispatchers were to dispatch rather than economics, the come down again to 4 hours. So, if we were to face this extremely unlikely condition, there are some mitigating actions that could be taken to reduce that risk. If you could page down one more, I think we have the conclusions. Okay, so After having completed this study last year, our conclusion was there's no immediate threat to the reliability of PJM. The second box there, we are reliable in all the announced retirements and the escalated retirements if we're under typical winter load conditions. And even if we have extreme winter load conditions, under the announced retirements, we seem to be fine. But then we did come up with some scenarios to identify points at which, an assumption or a combination of assumptions could begin to impact the ability to serve load. So that's why we saw on the preceding slide, there are some rare, unlikely simultaneous system conditions that could lead to problems. But even then, there seem to be some operating practices we could take to mitigate that load shedding event. So I guess I would conclude by just pointing out that this is, again, analysis that we do each year based, again, on the results of the capacity auction. Again, we have the advantage of knowing 3 years ahead on a firm basis what our fuel mix will look like because of that firm commitment. And we can run these cases to just ensure that even under some of these really extreme conditions where you have a 14-day cold snap, no gas supply coming out of the non-firm gas and economic dispatch and different pipelines being interrupted to see what kind of risk we might face. But this is certainly something that PJM monitors each year. We don't see any immediate threat to serving the load in real time in these operational considerations. But again, it is something that we will check each year. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was kind of everything I had on the fuel mix. I just wanted to, at the very end here, a couple slides on some of the capacity rule changes that PJM is considering with stakeholders regarding how we treat intermittent resources in the capacity market. Under the current rules, we set the capacity value of wind and solar units at their average output over a defined number of peak summer hours over the last 3 years. So it's a very straightforward calculation. I think it has a lot of intuitive appeal. The wind and solar owners can compute it themselves. And that's been in place now for 10 years or more. In general, I think the capacity value of wind tends to be about 15% of nameplate. And for solar, it tends to be anywhere 40% to 60%, depending upon, is it a fixed panel or a tracking panel? However, as the penetration of these two resources increases, there are some shortcomings of this treatment that PJM was concerned about. The first one there is this current approach includes many hours in the summer in which there is really little to no loss of load risk. If you're dealing with a very mild summer day, the output of wind and solar from a reliability standpoint is not terribly important over certain hours. From an energy standpoint, obviously it is, but we may be valuing the majority of those hours load. I think the second shortcoming of this approach is that it fails to that as the penetration level of wind and solar increases, their reliability value will decrease. And that's essentially because if you think about it, if more solar clears in the capacity market, it could displace, some that are more available 24/7. So if we clear a very large portion of solar generation instead of some of the thermal units, by the time you get to 9 p.m., when the load is still relatively high on a summer day and solar put out zero, we could face some reliability problems. So we concluded we need a more rigorous approach to kind of capture that saturation effect. So in the last bullet there, PJM is really over the last 3 or 4 months in a pretty intensive process has been developing an approach that's based on what's called effective load carrying capability that'll really value wind and solar based on their hourly contribution at times when the load is high and their reliability value is much more important. The good part of ELCC, or effective load carrying capabilities. It's a very general process that could also be extended to include storage and hybrid resources. So instead of our current 10-hour requirement on a battery, by requiring them to run 10 hours, that's a fairly long duration, their capacity value could be quite low. But using ELCC, we may be able to accommodate shorter term batteries, such as 4 hours, but appropriately derate them to recognize the fact that they're not quite as available as a 10 or 12 hour unit. So on the next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a quick schematic on what ELCC does. Again, it's a much more analytical LOE analysis to maintain our criteria of one event every 10 years. And the advantage of it is I think it really puts wind, solar, hybrid, and energy storage kind of on an equal playing field with all the other units, and better recognizes their true reliability value, which of course should be the basis of their value in the capacity market. All right, so I think I have one last slide here. Okay, so this is ELCC work has been an ongoing effort now for several months. We're sort of winding it down now. I think there are 4 proposals, one from PJM, one from the Independent Market Monitor, and then 2 more from stakeholders. I think there's a first read of it next week, and our members were hoping to get some consensus on moving to an ELCC-based approach, and the filing would go into FERC on October 30th of this year. I think it is important to point out that if we were to make any rule change, that would take effect no earlier than June 1st, 2022, because all the capacity auctions have already been run for prior delivery years under the current rules. So we clearly do not want to change the rules kind of midstream for a delivery year in which the base residual auction has already been run. So if folks are interested in following that process of this new proposed method, it'll unfold over the next couple months with a filing date of October 30th. So I believe that's everything I had on my slides. I'd be happy to take any comments or questions.
Okay, hang on a second here. Okay, I don't see any questions at the moment on the YouTube chat. So I think we did have one question come in by email on you listed all of the PJM capacity located in Indiana. And does that recognize, is that counting the Cook facility located in Michigan? Tom?
It does not. No. That's based on geographical location. So inside the state of Indiana.
Okay, very good. I'm still not seeing any questions. Let me ask Melissa a question here. Are you still there? Yes. Just out of curiosity, how do you take into account the installed capacity deliverability?
So in a resource adequacy construct?
Yes.
So how do we figure out that was a filing we just made, was how we redo capacity deliverability. For thermal and wind resources. So we look at their firm transmission capability to determine how much qualifies to be counted toward our resource adequacy construct. So it really depends on how much transmission capability you have assigned to you through the generator interconnection queue process and how much you're using, which determines how much capacity deliverability you have.
Okay, now I have another question here. What's the difference between I imagine it's a matter of degree, but what's the dividing line between scarcity and emergency pricing as you guys are thinking about it?
So emergency pricing is actually used in an emergency. So if you're called an emergency on your system, then you can go into an emergency pricing mode. So it's actually a called event. I'm pretty sure scarcity is when you're just on the verge of getting to the point where you need to be in an emergency, and you have scarce resources. So that's when scarcity pricing would kick in. Subject to check from others, but I'm pretty sure that's the difference.
Okay, I think I have a question here that just came on the live chat. It says, will the use of ELCC raise the curve in the reliability measurement above 1.0 with larger solar and wind in the portfolios? I think that's referring to your qualitative analysis.
Right, Brad, could you read that question again, please? I'm not sure I followed it.
Yeah, it says, will the use of ELCC raise the curve in the reliability measurement above 1.0 with larger solar slash wind in the portfolios?
Oh, I see. Okay. I think the short answer is no. The purpose of ELCC, I think, is to really get a fair estimate of the reliability value of, wind, solar, grids, and storage in the capacity market. When it comes to computing the composite reliability index, we will continue to model all the wind and solar batteries at actual output. So sort of the ELCC approach has already been incorporated into that composite reliability index calculation we did, because that analysis was actually performed, based on the actual hourly output of those resources. So I think it's fair to say the ELCC approach has already been embedded in that composite reliability index study.
All right, I'm not seeing any new questions yet, so I'll ask another one. Now, Melissa, and when we're looking at let me rethink this here a little bit. I'm trying to think. Are you guys taking into account yet the impact of DERs in the resource planning? My guess is it's not yet because it's probably so small, but has there been any thought or given to how that might start impacting your reliability planning?
Yeah, so we have DERs that are already participating, or LMRs, load modifying resources, that are subsets maybe of demand response resources that participate in our market and bid into the resource adequacy construct today. So there are parameters that they can use to bid in. But to your point, there are other DERs that are going to be behind the meter, so not on the transmission system. And we are starting to see, I think our organization of MISO states just did a survey of how many of those that we're seeing. So as we start to see more and more, especially with rooftop solar and other things, we're trying to figure out how to include them for visibility reasons in all of our processes. And I think Kristen will talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing to get more visibility to those, so that we can include them, at least know where they are on our system and know what the impacts they are having in our operations are going to be.
Brad, I've got a question. This probably mostly for Tom, but Melissa, if you could chime in too from a MISO perspective. Tom, you spent a good deal of time describing what kind of cataclysm would have to take place before a load shed would actually occur. Could you describe all four of the gas pipelines would have to be out? And what kind of a weather day would we have to have for what period of time before the demand response actions were not sufficient to cause a problem?
Okay, sure. I will try to answer that. I think the only time that we saw loss of load events was when we were facing a 14-day cold snap. And the reason we chose 14 days is I believe we looked at 45 years of weather history, and we had one 14-day period in which the average temperature was like 22 degrees or something. I forget exactly what. And then the winter peak itself would be what we call a 95th percentile load, which means there's a 95% chance that the winter peak will be below that number and only a 5% chance that it will be above. In other words, it's a 1 in 20 a winter event. And then, in terms of the gas pipeline disruptions, we would have to see those four pipelines unavailable. Therefore, gas units, even if they had a firm contract, would not be able to produce electricity unless they had some backup fuel, dual fuel, and some of them do. I think the reason we're seeing those very positive results is because PJM is pretty long in generation, for the next 5 to 10 years, just based on our projections. I think I pointed out the projected reserve margin is about 28%, when all we really need to be at 1 in 10 is about 15%. But we did want to really press the case to see, okay, at some point, when could problems arise? So I think it's just important to monitor that each year, but, to see if things change. And if so, if we have 3 or 5 years advance notice, perhaps we can tweak some rules in the capacity markets or some of the operational requirements. I mean, just as an example, when we had that polar vortex event I referred to, I think it was January 2018, we saw 22% forced outages in PJM, which was like unheard of. Our planning studies assume maybe 10 or 12% at the most. And the problem was we were having a lot of what are called common mode failures, that if a gas pipeline is unavailable, not just one unit, but all the units on that pipeline are going to fail at the same time. Mm-hmm. Our studies at the time had assumed independent forced outage rates. And that's why we were understating that risk. So since that event, we made a lot of changes to our planning models to make sure that we recognize that correlation or that potential correlation of forced outages. And in addition, I think between the winter of 2014 and 2015, we actually implemented some short-term operational changes to try to avoid what happened. And sure enough, in the following winter, we had a polar vortex event that was almost as bad as the previous one. But fortunately, we had implemented new rules like any unit that hasn't run in X number of months just has to come online in November and prove its ability to start up. Some units may need to add some thermal protection so that they can start in cold weather. So we had implemented some simple operational steps in the near term that I think helped that situation a lot. And I think those changes of 5 years ago are part of the reason, why we're seeing pretty positive results now when we do the analysis, and we really have to be facing a rather, extraordinary combination of conditions to face any kind of load shed event. Again, assuming that our reserve margins remain healthy, which they appear to be doing.
Thank you, Melissa. Is there any similar analysis for MISO that could demonstrate what the outer band is for that kind of load shed taking place?
Yeah, we do every year a summer and winter seasonal assessments that try to figure out very similar things about how what types of events would need to occur where we would see load shed, either local or more broadly. We're not in the same, we have, our reserve margin is closer to what we actually need. So we aren't long capacity in our market. So I think what I mentioned earlier is we've been seeing more times when events that occur will impact us even off peak. So not the summer peak. So we have been studying winter shoulder periods, what series of events would have to occur, like multiple outages, issues with load changing, with wind. We have a significant amount of wind, I think about 20,000 or 20 gigawatts of wind on our system. So I think we're trying to, we look at those tail events to figure out what will we do in the system to be able to maintain the system without load shed. You plan for the 1 in 10. I think that's why I said that we're looking at whether 1 in 10 is sufficient going forward, because we see these changes, especially with our resource fleet and the age of the fleet that we have, creating more forced outages and issues on our system that might drive us toward these tail events. And so we're trying to minimize those with some of our operational rules and some of our accreditation and other things that will help us get more toward the middle, so that we can plan the system as we operate it and see those events coming. So we do look at them. Like I said, right now, I think we're trying to figure out how we change some of the ways we look at these conditions to plan for them better and create market rules so we don't get in a situation that we need load shed.
All right, there's another question here on, this is for Tom. It's does PJM expect to increase the required reserve margin in the future, given the shift to more intermittent resources?
Sure, right. I don't think so. At least in my view, the PJM E4Ds, or forced outage rates, have been pretty stable now for a lot of years. The load diversity within PJM, the diversity we have in load compared to our neighbors, has been relatively constant. So my impression is the installed reserve margin, the required margin, is likely to stay right around 15 or 16%. However, with the change to the ELCC approach, or the adoption of ELCC, and the potential increase of wind and solar, I think as long as we value those resources properly, we will still be reliable at 15 or 16%. So I guess another way to say it is, it may take more nameplate capacity of wind and solar in order to satisfy the required reserve margin. So it may actually be more iron in the ground of wind and solar and storage, but we may be valuing those resources at a lower level, which means there just might have to be more of them in terms of nameplate. But the IRM number itself wouldn't change, because that, again, is based on sort of the reliability value of all those resources, not on their nameplate. So again, I think the reserve requirement is likely to stay very stable, but it may take more wind and solar or battery to kind of make up any shortcomings that may be identified through the ELCC approach.
Okay, I have another question here. This is from Dale Thomas, Commission staff. It said, how can we use these RTO reliability metrics you spoke about in our state resource decisions?
Was that for me or Tom, or both?
For both.
Okay, well, let me say that I think one of the things that we're doing is exactly trying to, because we know that the states have responsibility for resource adequacy. You do integrated resource plans every year. One of our goals and objectives in this resource needs assessment is to be able to provide the states with and the membership with what attributes we think they are going to need going forward so that you can include them in your integrated resource plan. So for example, if we think we're headed toward a 30 or 40% penetration of renewable resources, and because of that, we need a ramp capability, we would expect to be able to provide that information to the commission and to the members so that they could plan for that additional ramp capability in their integrated resource planning when they select resources that they want to build or buy going forward. So we're hoping that some of these, especially the attributes of the resources as we get further in, can help inform the integrated resource planning efforts of our members. And when you approve or you the integrated resource plans, you can ensure that we're taking into account some of those attributes that we need to keep the system operational going forward. So I think that will help with the state reliability plan that you are talking about.
I would agree with all those comments. I think some good observations there. I guess the one addition I might make is that obviously states are also concerned on a localized basis. The PJM overall loss of load criteria is one event in 10 years, but then PJM will also do a lot of sub-area analysis. We call it load deliverability. It's generally done by transmission owner zone or even by operating company within a transmission owner zone. So a lot of those studies are conducted through the RTEP, Regional Transmission Expansion Plan, and they are also reflected in the capacity auction. So I guess I would, I recommend to the states that they kind of continue to monitor what the results are for their individual states when it comes to load deliverability, generation deliverability, because those are studies that PJM does on an annual basis that I think could, certainly help inform their policies going forward.
Let me ask maybe an unfair question, and this will be the last one before our break. So therefore, if I may upset you, then just we can go to break. I follow what you're saying, but I kind of look at this when you're looking at generator reliability attributes that you're trying to provide. It's usually from a regional perspective. So how do you get a individual utility to maybe take on a more expensive resource that will provide that capability compared to maybe making a cheaper resource decision that results in lower cost for that utility? See what I'm saying? There's a difference between the reliability needs of maybe that one utility versus what the entire RTO region needs, or even a sub-region in the RTO needs. So how do you mesh those two incentives?
So that's I think the challenge that Indiana is facing right now with some of the conversations that are going on about a state reliability plan. I think we will be able to provide these attributes or things that we need reliability requirements by, I think we're looking at it more zonally. So we might be able to get it to Indiana, Kentucky at this point. I don't think that we would be assigning resources specific for each utility. I think that's going to be part of what an integrated resource plan and the sum of all those plans are for the state. So I think we're in a difficult situation there. I think accreditation could help because as we think of how we're going to accredit resources going forward, we're probably trying to figure out you get more capacity credit or credit for your resource if you have a resource that can provide certain attributes. So there's something to be said there. So you might get more value in the market for that. So that might help from an individual utility perspective. But I believe that one of the challenges that the state of Indiana faces, based on some things that I've heard, is how do you add all of those IRPs together and figure out who gets the burden of this additional attributes and who takes on the risk of it when they want a different kind of portfolio. And I think that's something that we still need to have a conversation about and try to resolve.
Tom, did you have anything?
Sure. No, I agree with what Melissa said there. I guess the one other point I would make is that, PJM has a lot of different markets. There's energy, there's capacity. There's also a regulation market, a black start capability market. So I think in terms of market signals and to kind of give people the incentive to provide some of these needed reliability attributes, those markets do exist. We try to be proactive about these concerns, which is why we look 5 to 10 years out. If PJM identifies there may be a shortcoming in providing certain attributes such as ramping or voltage control, there's always the possibility of making changes to our capacity market to provide the proper incentives or to actually implement a standalone market that addresses that potential shortfall. So I think it's really, incumbent on PJM and its stakeholders to kind of proactively address any future deficiencies, and take the steps today, primarily probably through market signals to address any of those potential shortcomings.
Anything else before we go to break? Okay, since we went a little bit over, let's take a break till, what is it, about 5 minutes past 2? And then we'll reconvene then for the transmission planning discussion. All right. So I'll see everybody. And thanks, Melissa and Tom, for everything you did.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, do we have our MISO speaker ready to go? Before we start it up here again?
Yep. Ben, are you on?
Hey, this is Ben Sterney. Can you hear me? I'm ready to roll.
We hear
Okay.
you, Ben. Ben, you'll take it, and then we'll hand it off to PJM.
Sounds good. We ready to get going, or need to wait a couple minutes?
Let's make sure the YouTube feed is working here.
Okay.
And hi, this is Sue, just from PJM, just confirming I'm on the line as well. But I'll be on mute for now.
All right, it looks like we have the YouTube feed working, and right now we are ready to move into the transmission planning discussion, and we'll follow the same format that we did earlier with MISO kicking it off, followed by PJM, and then we will go into questions. Again, they can come in by the live chat on YouTube, by email to Bob Pauley. I think we will take off here. Again, as I said earlier, for the MISO and the PJM speakers, just do a brief introduction of who you are and your background, and then just feel free to dive into your conversation. And as we said earlier, you are driving your own, sharing your document or your presentation from your computer. So if you start having difficulties, let us know, and we will try to share it from our end. But I think it's working pretty well if you guys are doing that. All right. Thank you.
All right. Can everyone confirm they can see my presentation on the screen?
Ben, I can see
I
it.
can see it.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. So as a quick introduction, my name is Ben Sterney. I've been with MISO for about 7 years, and I currently work in the Planning Coordination and Strategy Group. So we tackle a variety of policy and economic planning related items. Most recently, I've spent a lot of time working on MISO's cost allocation filings, so I have a pretty good understanding of a lot of our cost allocation, both history and recent changes, which I'll get into later. Additionally, for those that follow along with MISO Things, you'll probably see my name pop up on a number of interregional planning items. So I help facilitate a lot of our joint planning efforts with both SPP and PJM. I'm actually based out of our Minnesota office in the Twin Cities, but for those that can see the video, I have strategically placed my Notre Dame sports memorabilia in the background here, hopefully to gain some audience points. So we'll see how that goes. Just a quick overview of my presentation. For the first half of this, I'll be just giving a broad overview of the MISO planning process and some of the underlying principles behind it. And in the second half, I will go over some of the more recent activity that's been going on in the planning world. So to start things off, I'm going to talk about the MISO value-based planning approach. So the objective of our transmission planning process is to develop a robust transmission solution, or develop robust transmission solutions to provide that long-term value under a wide range of potential conditions. And throughout this, we also need to ensure that we are complying with any federal, state, or local reliability standards or public policy initiatives or mandates. And within that objective, we're trying to design a system that minimizes total costs. So we want to aim to optimize that capacity of investment along with transmission expansion and not weight too heavily one way or the other. Our planning process really falls into 4 buckets. We're looking at regional planning, so long-term regional planning at a wide area system view on a 10 to 20 year time frame. And we're trying to really help optimize the use of resources in a cost-efficient and in a cost-efficient manner. We also have a resource planning component. So we're evaluating and facilitating the ability of new generator resources to reliably and efficiently connect to the grid. We have, to inform our regional planning process, we also deal in policy assessments. So we need to help inform that planning process and understand long-term impacts of policy decisions. And we have a number of teams dedicated to supporting a variety of different policy analysis or helping our planning process identify ways to incorporate federal and state mandates. And finally, we have a local planning component of the planning process, or we kind of commonly refer to this as bottom-up planning. And this is to really accommodate local planning needs from our transmission owners and local utilities, and really help them meet the minimum criteria for safe and reliable operation in the MISO system. So I've introduced our value-based planning process, and now I want to talk a little bit about the guiding principles that sort of drive those processes as an underlying framework. These guiding principles are have been a part of our planning process really throughout since the inception of our planning process, and they're reviewed. I think it's on an every other year basis by our board of directors. So we've improved and massaged some of the language around our guiding principles, but they have generally remained the same over the years. We need to develop a transmission plan to help accommodate those local and regional standards that I mentioned before, primarily driven by NERC criteria for reliability. We want to help make the most economically efficient market possible and identify transmission projects to help provide access to those lowest cost resources. On top of that, I mentioned cost allocation is a huge component of this, and we are striving to allocate the costs roughly commensurate with the beneficiaries of these projects. So an important component to any transmission upgrade is ensuring that costs are allocated appropriately. All of this is in coordination with supporting state and federal policy and ensuring that state and federal policy makers have appropriate information to make decisions. The last component is also near and dear to my heart, and it's one of our newer guiding principles, really enacted after FERC Order 1000 expanded interregional planning. But we need to coordinate our planning process with our neighbors, and that comes from developing joint studies and just with SPP, PJM, and other MISO neighbors, and really trying to eliminate those barriers of communication between our different shops. So I talked a lot about the guiding principles, and I don't want to belabor this too much, but I do want to highlight that we don't do any of this work in a vacuum, and really we couldn't do a lot of our planning process without input and guidance from state regulators and OMS. And as I was putting this deck together, I stumbled across on the OMS website, there's a transmission planning strategic priorities list, and they happen to align, I thought, very, very well with our guiding principles and our value-based planning process. So I won't go into this in any detail, but the strategic priorities, in supporting long-range transmission needs, helping capture future uncertainties through appropriate long-term resource assumptions, and providing guidance on new and emerging technology like storage. All of that is integral to our planning process and really help make it successful. So, as I've alluded to, all this input, whether it be from this bottom-up planning process in coordination with our transmission owners and engineering staff, to top-down planning for regional development of economic projects, or even GI studies, generator interconnection studies, for reliable resource integration. The culmination of all these coordinated processes results in our annual MISO Transmission Expansion Plan, or MTEP. And we typically refer to the MTEP process as an 18-month rolling cycle or rolling process. And by that, I mean the MTEP cycle actually starts before the previous MTEP cycle is completed. So we are working to finalize MTEP 20 right now, but MTEP 21 is actually already underway. And I'll also note that all the processes listed here don't necessarily follow the same, this sort of annual timeline that we've established. We have special policy assessments that may take multiple years. For example, the Renewable Integration Impact Assessment, or RIA, I think Melissa mentioned that briefly in her presentation. That's been going on for multiple years and multiple cycles. Our generator interconnection queue has very specific timing criteria based on when those studies start. So not everything is necessarily nicely wrapped up at the end of each year, but at the end of the day, all this information is, in whatever state it might be in, is feeding this ultimate expansion plan that is approved by our MISO board of directors at the end of each year. So changing gears a little bit, the last half of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how those planning processes are being put to use right now and some more interesting topics that are under development at MISO currently. The first item is the development of our MISO futures. So we're developing a set of future scenarios right now to be used in future planning studies. And these are categorized as our MTEP 21 futures. So we're building, this is a pretty significant stakeholder process. It went through sort of a reimagining recently in the sense that our future scenarios have gone through a number of recent workshops over the 2019-2020 years. Our objective has remained the same as previous cycles. We're hoping to bookend a possible set of future scenarios. And the goal there is to really help us build that robust business case for any projects that come out of our planning processes. So we might have like a low end or a high end with a set of different assumptions, but at the end of the day, we can have a sort of no regrets look at projects. For our current future scenarios, we're really trying to implement a lot of those items that Melissa referred to in her presentation. The changing resource mix is driving a lot of changes in our industry. The top of the two pie charts at the top are very representative of some of the scenarios we're trying to capture. In the last 15 years or so, we've seen this dramatic shift in this resource portfolio. And we want to design futures that really help accommodate that. And there's a lot of inputs that go into these as well. We obviously need a lot of information from state IRPs and utility and state announcements. And in addition, we're looking at other policy-related items like carbon emission reduction and electrification. Again, all of this is driven through a detailed stakeholder coordination process, as well as reviewing historical trends and other data points. So we are in the process of wrapping up this future development. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 more meetings, but the anticipated completion date is early fall for the final futures. So with this future design in mind, noting the industry trends are driving MISO members to make some significant changes to their resource portfolios. We have recently launched a plan, kicked off a plan called the Long Range Transmission Planning Effort to help identify grid needs based on the futures and really those industry trends we are trying to evaluate. So we've just kicked off this effort at our Planning Advisory Committee this month. with that objective of ensuring reliable and efficient, of designing a reliable and efficient system to enable those changing portfolios for both the near and long term. So I kind of want to highlight that it's a comprehensive approach. So it is a long-range transmission plan, but there might be shorter-term needs that we may need to focus on sooner. So upgrades identified through this process could definitely have different planning horizons. Also wanted to highlight that another focus point of this would be sub-regional needs. So I've highlighted a couple of areas of interest on the map here. The circle in the Minnesota, Wisconsin area, that's really looking at integration of renewables and studying stability interface limits in that region. Our queue is still fairly significant in that MISO West area. We're also taking a look at things like relieving congestion points related to Michigan import constraints, and enabling resource flexibility on our north-south interface. So that circle right in the middle of the map there between Arkansas and Illinois. So our long-range transmission plan, it's still in the very early stages of design. As I've kind of noted this multi-step process, we're really still in step one, designing those futures, but we'll be ramping up work on this in late 2020 and early 2021, and we'll be providing frequent stakeholder updates along the way. So this next item, just wanted to highlight some highlights from our most recent MTEP 20, as well as some of the other projects that are under construction or underway in Indiana. We've got most of the investment is in this category of projects we define as other. They're not driven by baseline reliability needs or market efficiency, but tend to be localized planning needs, things like age and condition rebuilds or load interconnection, items like that. In MTEP 20, these projects are being recommended for approval at the end of the year, and it tends to fall in line with a typical MTEP cycle. We're seeing the majority of projects are really those localized needs, fairly minimal baseline reliability needs, and then always a handful of generator interconnection projects in the docket. In addition, we have some notable projects in the Indiana area. Duff Coleman, our first market efficiency project that was eligible for competition, was approved back in MTEP 2015, and that project just went into service. It was energized in June of 2020. And then another significant highlight, as someone who does interregional planning, we have our first cost-shared project with PJM going for board approval in September 2020, the Bosserman to Trail Creek project in NIPSCO. This project was studied in 2019, but was delayed slightly due to MISO's cost allocations filings. We had to wait on FERC approval for that cost allocation before we could officially put it into our expansion plan. But FERC just recently approved that cost allocation piece, and it'll be going towards that board next month. Next up is cost allocation. I mentioned that this is one of our guiding principles to ensure that we have the appropriate cost allocation mechanisms identifying that beneficiaries pay for the cost of any proposed upgrades. We had a pretty significant FERC filing related to this, specifically to that market efficiency row. So prior to our FERC filing, which was just approved this summer, market efficiency projects had to be 345 kV and above, and we recently dropped that voltage threshold to 230 kV. So it really expands that cost sharing component for market efficiency projects to a lower voltage threshold. In addition to that, through the stakeholder process, we developed some additional benefit metrics. in addition to the typical adjusted production cost savings, which is our economic benefit measure, we also can include the benefits of avoiding a reliability upgrade, as well as the avoided payment for the MISO joint parties settlement agreement for north to south transfers. The remaining components have gone unchanged from previous cost allocation mechanisms. I'll highlight just to highlight a couple of the interesting components of them. Our multi-value projects, or MVPs, are postage stamped, so they're spread across the entire region. Baseline reliability projects are allocated to the local transmission pricing zone where they reside. Generator interconnection projects are typically just paid for by the interconnecting customer. However, there is a cost sharing component for network upgrades that are 345 kV and above. Those costs are spread 10% postage stamp across the whole footprint. And then the remaining items, transmission service request related projects are typically paid for by the transmission customer, and we have a market participant funding mechanism as well, where a market participant can choose to fully fund the project. And for my last slide, I just wanted to highlight a recent filing that FERC made related to storage. We have an item called Storage as a Transmission Asset, or SATOA, to enable energy storage as an MTEP project. And this was in development for quite some time. We had a project in the MTEP 19 cycle that really sparked a lot of this discussion and this filing. So our initial filing was made this December. After some additional discussion and technical conference, FERC ultimately accepted that filing this month. And for more details, I've referenced the FERC docket number here. There's a lot of good content in there. I don't know if I can really capture it very well in my single slide, but I do encourage folks to, if they are interested in this, to go check out that docket and take a look at some of the technical conference information, because there's a lot of interesting discussion and more development of this to come. And with that, that's the end of my prepared content. I will turn it back over to PJM, and I'll hang on the line for questions at the Q&A.
Okay, good afternoon. This is Suzanne Glatz. I'm with PJM. I'm just going to do a real quick sound check if everybody can hear me while I get up my presentation.
Yes.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, great. All right. Just want to make sure I can see the presentation. Okay, can everyone see that presentation? I just want to double check here.
Yes.
Okay, because for some reason I am not seeing it on my screen here. Give me a second. Hold on a second. I just need to. I can see all of you. Okay, there we go. All right. So thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this presentation. I'll just give a little bit of quick background on who I am. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Planning at PJM in the System Planning Division. And just to be clear, when I say infrastructure planning, that is not an IT role. That is transmission infrastructure that I'm talking about. And I've been with PJM for close to 9 years now. And in that role, it's been largely around system planning, transmission planning aspects, generation and transmission. Prior to joining PJM, I worked at PPL Electric Utilities, also again in transmission planning, regulatory affairs, and matters associated with also the PJM interconnection specifically. And prior to that, about 15 years in engineering consulting, doing design and system analysis. So overall, I've been in the industry with planning for quite a long time now, working on system planning, analysis, design, as well as really more asset management. All right, so with that, I'm going to talk about what PJM is doing and how we approach planning. So you're probably going to hear a lot of things that are very similar to what Ben just talked about. Obviously, when it comes into transmission planning, there's, we're interlaced essentially our systems. And of course, we're all following planning to NERC criteria, so there's going to be a lot of commonality here. Turn the page down here. Okay. So right now, what I have shown on the screen is you can see Indiana, and you can see the shaded areas that covers what is the PJM service territory within Indiana. And obviously the rest of that is in the MISO area. Now the transmission lines, you'll see 345 and 765 lines. So those are part of PJM's planning responsibility, but they obviously extend beyond the boundaries. And so really this is just another way of emphasizing points you probably have heard already a lot of times today, and that is around the interconnected nature of the grid and how important it is that that we work together, because the system is things that happen on one part of the system affect the rest of the system as a whole. And if we zoom out a little bit further, then you can see this is the entire PJM region. Obviously, MISO is a very key neighbor that we do an awful lot of interregional planning and coordination with because of how interconnected we are. But we do also plan interregionally with our neighbors to the north and to the south of us as well. And again, as I said, this is something to always remember when you're talking about interregional around transmission planning. As electrons, they don't worry about state boundaries, they don't worry about contractual boundaries, they don't worry about utility boundaries. They're going to follow the path of least resistance. And consequently, also, when things happen on the system, they might look geographically far away, but electrically they could be very near and could be impactful. But that also provides potentially some opportunities, and that is something I think you probably also heard today, is that when you look regionally, you may be able to find solutions that could be more cost-effective or more efficient to address problems that might be in multiple areas and affecting multiple utility systems. And so that's one of the values of the RTO view of the system, is that we are going to look at the whole region and recognize when sometimes the solutions, yes, they are local and they might not benefit from that regional look, whereas there may be other cases where they do benefit, and in which case that's the value of having all the analysis that we do to look at all the solutions that might be there. So what is our tech planning? What are we doing in terms of transmission planning? So similarly to what Ben talked about, is we are looking to ensure the reliability of the system. The planning criteria, obviously we are meeting the NERC reliability criteria. But a little bit more about that. It's not just we're planning for the loss of transmission lines or generators, but what are the other key conditions? So one of them is ensuring that the generation is deliverable on the PJM system. And so that's a key part of our RTEP planning that we do on an annual basis. So when I say RTEP, I should clarify, that's our Regional Transmission Expansion Planning process. And some of the things that we're looking at also is looking for opportunities for improving the market efficiency. So that's looking at where there may be congestion on the system and identifying those points of congestion, and then allowing developers to propose solutions that could reduce the congestion on the system to allow generation to that might be bottled up in certain pockets that could be low-cost generation that just can't reach the load, but this would provide that opportunity for that generation to access those markets. And obviously, when you bring the price down, that can bring it down across the region. So we also look at operational performance where there may be some conditions that are more, localized, or you only see them in an operational environment, not necessarily in planning models. And so those are also part of our RTEP planning. Just to cover a few of the things that we're seeing in terms of the RTEP planning aspects and like some of the trends. So one of the things is we're not seeing a significant load growth. In fact, it's seemingly kind of flat. However, while it may be flat across the region, it doesn't mean that we don't need new transmission, because sometimes it's growing at a somewhat unevenly. So there may be some areas where there's a lot of growth, and there may be other cases where the load is actually going down. And so when you have that change on the system where the load is, that can drive the need for additional transmission to accommodate that. Talked probably a lot of today about the evolving capacity resource mix. That's also driving some need for transmission. And customer behaviors, what they're doing in terms of things like adding rooftop solar. That changes what the load looks like and when the load is there, and that also can impact our plans. One other thing is aging infrastructure. So that's another key element that may be driving transmission. And that is, this stuff is, the transmission, it lives a long time. The nice thing about it, it's when you build it, it lasts 40, 50, 60 years, but it does have a lifespan, and it does eventually need to be replaced. Currently, it's probably getting a lot more attention, and that's partially maybe in part due to the fact that in prior 10 years or so, or I should say before that, we had some substantial load growth. Load was growing at 3% a year almost, and that was driving the need for transmission. So when you're building new transmission to accommodate load, you may, at the same time, actually be addressing some aging facilities. So it's not always apparent that we've been actually addressing some of that aging infrastructure throughout the planning time period. So I just wanted to point that out, because I know it's kind of a little bit of a flashpoint these days about the aging infrastructure, but it's still important to maintain it and to ensure the reliability of the system. In this slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I just want to pause just to geographically show where some of the larger transmission projects that are being constructed in PJM. So these are projects that are at least 10 million or greater. These are all this information is on PJM's website. But again, this is really just wanted to highlight a little bit about where that work is occurring on the system. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about cost allocation. Again, this is generally an area that gets a lot of questions. And how does it work? Who pays, essentially? Who pays for the transmission? So there's three types of projects that we build in PJM, and we have baseline upgrades, network upgrades, and supplemental projects. Supplemental projects are probably similar to the local plan projects that MISO does, where they are really focused on the local system needs. And so those are 100% to those zonal utilities that are constructing those projects for those very local needs. We also have network upgrade projects, and these costs are borne by the interconnecting customers, and that's the generators. And that is based on the fact that generators, if not for that generator, you would not have to build that new transmission to interconnect them. And so they bear that risk of paying for those upgrades, and with the expectation that they will then have the opportunity to recover those costs when they sell their generation, either in the form of capacity or energy or ancillary services. The last category I want to talk about are baseline upgrades. And these are the category of projects that I was just talking about with the RTEP planning, in terms of we identify when we need transmission to meet reliability criteria because load has changed, because generation has deactivated, or load has shifted on the system. Or we've identified market efficiency needs on the system that would that could reduce the cost to customers by building new transmission, or public policy drivers. In the case of the baseline upgrades, the allocation essentially is similar to MISO. It's a beneficiary pays construct. And that is when we identify what the solution is, we are looking at not just who causes the problem, like where was the original reason to even solve this need, but really once we identify what the solution is, what are the zones that would be benefiting from that new transmission? And we have kind of a two-tier level. So if it's below 345 kV, this is all based on distribution factors. So that's that calculation of looking at where the flows are changing, and it's 100% calculated to who is benefiting, which might be one zone, two zones, or multiple zones. For facilities that are greater than or equal to 345 kV double circuit, in this case, we recognize that there is some inherent regional benefit across the system. And in which case, so 50% of those costs would be regionally allocated. And what I mean by that is based on the load in the zones, that would be their percent allocation of the overall PJM system. The other 50% would be based on the distribution CFAX calculation, where again, looking at where the flows are changing as a result of that new upgrade. All right, so now I want to switch gears, talk a little bit about generation. I know we've talked a lot about generation. Hopefully I can provide some new insights. Maybe it's a little bit different than what we've talked about from the capacity perspective, but a little bit more from interconnecting these projects. So one thing I do want to first highlight is, if you look on the slide there on the left, is this is about the last 6 years of interconnection requests that we have received through our PJM queue. And for those not familiar with PJM, the process that we have to interconnect generations is that we have 2 queues a year, in which case generators apply to interconnect, and it's a first come, first served kind of basis. There is a queue order, and we study them in queue order, and it's a rights-based process. So essentially, if there's capability on the system, the first queue project would basically have the opportunity to take advantage of what that capability is, and then the subsequent would be modeled on top of that. But what I want to highlight in this slide is you can see the queue has been steadily growing over the last 5 to 6 years. It's pretty significant in terms of the number of customers that want to interconnect to the PJM system. And I don't even have 2020 shown, but I can tell you it's already trending that we expect that it'll be even higher than 2019. And this is across the PJM region. And certainly you've already heard lots of solar, lots of wind in the queue. We do still have some natural gas that's under study, but largely the newer projects are wind, solar, and we're starting to see an uptick, obviously, also in storage. So let me let's hone in a little bit more on to what's happening specifically in Indiana. As you can see, solar makes up by far the bulk of the queue projects that are currently coming into our PJM queue and looking to interconnect into the PJM system. I will note there are some natural gas projects also under study, but those are actually probably maybe 2 queues back or even 3 queues back that have come in. So they are still working their way through the study process. But with the last queue that closed, I believe it was almost entirely solar, wind, and storage that's looking to interconnect in Indiana. And on this slide, I think a picture is always worth 1,000 words. This is an opportunity to really display, where are these projects coming in? And much like the last slide, you can see there's lots of solar and wind projects that are looking to interconnect to the system. These are projects that are still under study. There is still also some natural gas, although those are projects that have come into the system a little bit earlier. I'm sorry, that's storage. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's storage. There is some natural gas, but I think it's only one project. It's probably not as obvious by this slide. The other thing I want to highlight here is you'll notice where they are clustered, and they're around the major transmission lines. And this is really recognizing that it's through accessing, interconnecting to these large transmission lines that provides the opportunity to minimize the impacts to the system, because it's through those transmission lines that the generation is able to get into the major load centers, whether they're in Indiana or the neighboring states such as Chicago or in Ohio. And so there's a lot of clusters of these new generation projects right along these major transmission lines. Okay, we've talked about transmission planning, talked about some of the generation planning, and and I kind of talked about them a little bit separately, but now I want to actually talk about a little bit of the intersection of where these two separate planning processes might be merging down in the future. And so what I have here shown, and this is really around the state renewable goals and how we might be achieving them. So right now, when generation wants to interconnect, we identify transmission essentially through our interconnection queue study process. And that is, as I discussed, where generators, they apply to interconnect into the transmission grid. We study those projects for all the impacts, whether it's thermal due to overloads, whether it's a short circuit or voltage issues with changing the system to interconnect that project. And then we identify what new transmission would need to be built to accommodate that project. But we also, it's an incremental kind of study, because you study one project at a time, recognizing that the state renewable goals are not by project basis, but they're larger goals that may be over many years. And so there's an opportunity to also identify that transmission through our regional transmission expansion planning process. And the way that could occur is through using our state agreement approach, which is essentially the process that we could plan to public policy that would be identified by the states. And so on the slide, you'll see I've actually shown a couple of different drivers. We have the reliability drivers, we have market efficiency drivers, but we also have the public policy. I'd like to emphasize that the state agreement approach is not a substitute for the interconnection queue. Projects would still have to enter into our interconnection queue, because you have to have the unique aspects that are unique to your project that would have to be studied. However, when you have large goals that are going to go across the region, the public policy driver could be an opportunity to develop the larger transmission that could accommodate the long-term goals, larger goals that states might establish. It's not necessary. There's obviously a number of tools in the toolkit that states have at their disposal in order to develop this transmission and to achieve their goals. And really, this is just an opportunity to share that this is potentially one more tool in the toolkit that might be suitable, given some of the more ambitious goals. Certainly, our queue process has been effective. It's certainly worked the last 20 years, and we've interconnected lots of wind, lots of solar is already working its way through. We have a lot of storage that has come onto the system, and we expect more. So certainly the process, it works. It can continue to work. States have many of their own processes that are outside of the PJM process that also work in concert with our study process. And really, the state agreement approach is just potentially another tool. So PJM, we are educating stakeholders about how that works and getting more input on should we actually implement on that at the request of any of the states. So with that, I think that is my last slide, and I am going to, I think, stop sharing and hand this back to others, and we can take questions at this point.
Okay, I don't see any questions at the moment, but this is Brad Borum. I will ask a question in terms of the interregional planning processes. How does that work when you're, say, planning a transmission that goes across both the MISO and the PJM territories? And how does that work? Is it a little bit different, but depending upon the type of project you're talking about, if it's reliability or economic or something else? So if you would, each of you would touch on that, that would be helpful.
Okay, I don't know, Ben, do you want to go first or you want me to jump in first?
Sure, I can start off. Yeah, we have actually a very prescriptive process outlined in our joint operating agreement with between MISO and PJM. And you're right, the process is a little bit different depending on the driver we're looking at. So we have some criteria around economic planning, around reliability planning, and some different project types that define what the project is we're looking at and what that study process looks like. We have some flexibility. There's been some changes, I guess, relatively recently that allow us to really leverage our regional process when we're studying all of these different project types. So in the past, we used to develop a joint model between both RTOs. So we had both had stakeholders and staff developing this model, and we would evaluate that model to determine if there's beneficial projects. Now we kind of take any issues, any project ideas from both of our regional processes and bring them together and see if there's a more beneficial project that can be developed. So by leveraging our regional processes, we can kind of perform this joint planning piece a little more efficiently. I'll see if Suzanne has anything she wants to add.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit. There's a number of things also we've done too recently in the last, I think, cycle. We've actually shifted our 2-year long-term market efficiency planning cycle by a few months, and that helps us align a little bit better with the timing of when MISO is also looking for solutions. So that's one of the ways in which we're continuing to look at how we can get better alignment. We have regular communications, particularly around the market efficiency in terms of looking for long-term solutions. But also, I want to take at least a few minutes to talk also about the generation interconnections from an interregional point of view. That's, again, another area where our interconnections team and MISO also have regular meetings and check-ins to make sure that when there are projects that are along the seams and could affect other systems, that we're getting that identified as early as possible so that, whoever that transmission owner is that's affected, can be, informed and start working on that analysis. And that ensures that, one, that those impacts are identified, and so that can be resolved. But also, it helps us get results back to the generator customers who are looking to move these projects along, which is a little more important today maybe than it was in the past, largely because a lot of these projects can get built faster. So when you're talking about solar and, for instance, in wind projects, these projects can get constructed in a much quicker time, potentially, than, let's say, some of the larger combined cycle power plants, which might take several years to get built. So that's another area we're looking to improve our coordination.
Okay, I have a question that's on the YouTube live chat. It's from Sean Brady. It is, what is PJM doing to increase grid flexibility to account for the increased proportion of renewable resources in the queue?
Okay, there are probably a number of areas. So that question goes to, let me start first with the study process. So one of the things is we're getting, obviously, a substantial increase in the number of projects. So that's the first step, is just being able to process a huge number of projects. And so we've made a number of changes in our process in terms of adding more staff to get the studies done more quickly, to get those out to customers so that they can make those decisions and progress to get interconnected. We are still, I think, a long ways off from where there's the concern about the number of some of these renewable projects that can interconnect. I think we certainly have enough analysis, and I think Tom Fallon talked a lot about that in terms of the capability of what we can accommodate on the system. But part of that flexibility is also in what we're doing in terms of resilience, for instance. So obviously we talked a lot, Tom talked, I think if the person was here to listen to some of that discussion, the studies around the resource mix and how the portfolio changes, you know, and what the system can accommodate. So that was a key element in the first place to really understand, you know, what are the risks with the resource mix, and, you know, when is it potentially, you know, an issue. And in fact, actually our system can accommodate a wide range of portfolios that might occur down in the future. Other aspects we're doing is, with our resilience planning, is looking at some of these more, what we call sometimes maximum credible events or potentially cascading events, where you would have a number of things lost that would trigger substantial loss on the system, and what would we do? What are there things that we can do to minimize that exposure? And not just the events like man-made events, but also things like coordinated attacks. And so we have a number of processes. One, looking at our regular planning. If we do add a new transmission line, we will be looking at not only does it solve whatever need we had, whether that was a contingency type event, but does it also create a new vulnerability by having too many lines, let's say, concentrated at a substation. So we might not do that solution and do another solution that gives us a little bit more diversity on the system and so that we can be more resilient. We're also looking in a few cases where there may be some existing resilience issues where we may actually be building some new transmission. It might not even be significantly large or expensive, but just minor configurations on the system that can make it less vulnerable to some of these coordinated types of events. And so while these may be not geared towards resource flexibility, but they will still have those benefits to being able to accommodate and be more flexible in the future.
Okay, I have another question from the YouTube live chat. This is from Mike Mooney. MISO slides don't mention the RECB task force, which has been meeting for several years. Does this indicate plans to use a different cost allocation than those RECB discussions?
Nope, not at all. The RECB task force, or our Regional Expansion Criterion Benefits Task Force, is still an integral part of our planning process and is the primary forum we'll be using for cost allocation discussions going forward. So they are very, very much still an important part of future cost allocation and MISO.
Okay, I'll ask a question here. You know, the RTOs don't do traditional integrated resource planning, but yet to do transmission planning, you have to develop load projections across your regions. And you also have to do projections of where generation will be built and the type of generation will be built to have some idea of what type of generation or transmission capability you need to be developing. So you go into a little bit about how you do go about doing that. I know you guys don't like to get into talking about it, but you do have to make projections about where the load will be, and you have to make projections about where generation is likely to be located and the type of generation.
Okay, I'll kick this one off a little bit. So from transmission planning, first of all, from the load planning aspect, there are a couple of steps that go towards that. First is we do forecast the load based on economics and GDP as well as a number of other factors. We also take into account things like rooftop solar, so we incorporate that in also into our load forecast, and then also get input from the different transmission owners that also, because they may have some unique load information. So we put all that together, and of course we present all this to all the stakeholders to make sure that we're getting everybody's input in developing what that forecast is, and that will be for the next 15 years. So that's a key element to doing the planning, and of course if there are some unique distributions of load where a specific zone might have it a little bit distributed differently, where they might have, like I said, pockets of significant growth and pockets where it's not. Obviously, we'll address that distribution as well, because certainly there is some transmission that is going to have some local impacts as a result of that load. In terms of the generation, how it is modeled, we rely on the project data that is from what's in our interconnection queue. So any generators that have executed an interconnection service agreement, based on our data, we show that those have a very high probability of reaching commercial operation. So those will be modeled into our system, and we will know we know the size of those projects, the type of interconnection rights they're seeking, the target dates that they expect to be in service, and obviously the fuel type that those projects are. We also have the ability to model projects that have executed what is a facility study agreement. So these are projects that have not yet executed their interconnection agreement, but they are at the last step in the phase to complete the study process, and likewise also have a fairly high probability of reaching commercial operation. So those units we generally would only model in the sense that if they could be causing a problem that had to be addressed, or if based on the load growth that we didn't have enough generation to meet the load, we would include generation that had executed a facility study agreement. So that's how we incorporate what generation is going to be included in the system, is by looking at what's in our interconnection queue. And obviously that looks, when you look at the dates of those projects, that is sufficient for us to work with our 5-year plan, certainly at a minimum, and if need be for the 15-year with the facility study agreement projects. I'll hand it over to Ben.
Thanks. I can add a little bit about MISO's process as well. This really goes back to a little bit of what I talked about when it comes to our future development and this bookending uncertainty concept. We try to design our future forecasts in terms of generation portfolio and load to reflect a range of possible scenarios, so that if we develop any projects, we can have really a no regrets type of feeling about it. So that futures process is fairly robust. It's heavily stakeholder driven from both all of our membership, our TO membership, state regulators, federal policy. All of that is developed through a number of workshops in developing these futures. We do some capacity expansion using a software called the GIS. And get very specific input on things from our members. From a load development standpoint, to supplement what our members provide, we also use a state utility forecasting group to help provide that independent load forecast as well. So it's heavily stakeholder driven, as well as a significant amount of planning and software manipulation to really help develop those items.
I'm not seeing any other questions, and let me check. Do we have any questions that come in by email? Okay. I'll just give another moment or two here for to see if some questions come in. Then if not, what we will do is we will just, there won't be a break here. We'll just go right into the next topic. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming in unless one of the other. Oh, somebody want to speak?
I just wanted to say thanks for having me on this panel, but I'm going to drop off now. I have another meeting to go to. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks for me as well. Appreciate it.
All right, now let's move on. Since there are no questions, then our speakers are going on to other tasks. Can we move on to the few minutes early to the DER roundtable with Doug Gotham, and we have a couple of PJM speakers, or I should say one PJM speaker and another MISO speaker, if I remember right. Take a look here.
Yeah, Brad, Tim Burgess is on for PJM.
Kristen Swenson's on from MISO.
Okay.
And this is Doug. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
So Doug, do you prefer I assume you just want the two speakers to kick it off?
Sure.
Okay. So as I said, Doug will be our moderator, and hopefully he has questions prepared to ask if we don't have any coming on through the live chat or by email. And as before, I think the first person to speak will be from the MISO. So is that you, Kristen?
That is me.
All right. Well, if you would please just give a little overview of yourself and your background, and then just go right into your presentation, if you would, please.
I will do that. So my name is Kristen Swenson. I am the DER program manager at MISO. I've been with MISO a little bit over 2 years now. Before that, I was actually a MISO stakeholder and worked on industrial scale wind farms in MISO for about 15 years, as well as wind farms around the country. So I've been learning a tremendous amount about DER over the last couple of years and what the implications will be for the system. I'm going to try to go ahead. Are you seeing the presentation? Yeah, I'm seeing nodding. That's a good sign. I'm not seeing the screen move forward. There we go. So I wanted to make an introduction of what MISO defines as demand response. MISO defines as DER to include demand response. It's important to draw that distinction in part because the DOE, FERC, NERC, and a number of other standards agencies all draw separate distinctions on what constitutes DER. And so at MISO, when we talk about our DER and our DER policies, Melissa referred to earlier that we have a tremendous amount of DER participating in our market that is mostly in the form of demand response. So in terms of distributed generation, that's still limited and just coming online, especially for interest in wholesale markets. We do have distributed generation behind the meter that's been there for a long time. We're seeing growth in that particular area as well. But we include demand response in the DER program. So when we do education on DER, we include demand response in that education with MISO. I wanted to show everybody a little bit of the capacity in the overall MISO footprint. So this is not broken down by state and this is not Indiana only. This is the entire MISO footprint. We get information from the assets that register to participate in our markets. We also really crucially get some good information on the DER that is not participating in our market via the OMS annual survey. So Stu spoke this morning about the generation survey. There's also a separate DER survey that OMS sends out every year. And part of what we've learned from that survey is how much DER is potentially out there that MISO has no visibility into. MISO can't see it at all. These are just survey respondents saying, hey, we have some solar or we have some residential, non-residential installations on our distribution systems that do not participate in the MISO market. And so MISO has absolutely no idea sort of where they are, how they interact with the system, and what they might be causing on the overall bulk electric system that we manage. So I'll talk a little bit more about visibility here. But it's critical to know that MISO does not have any visibility at all into those resources that are installed on the distribution system. I wanted to, as I talk about visibility, I also want to draw a distinction, an important distinction. So over the course of the last couple of years, MISO and OMS have worked together to host a series of DER workshops all over the MISO region. So we've had, I think, something like 19 workshops in 2 years because we repeat some of them in multiple MISO regions, talking to our members, talking to stakeholders, interested parties, and trying to get to know some of the distribution folks that are in the MISO footprint so that we can work on common issues and common topics. The state-federal jurisdictional divide between the distribution system and the transmission system means that we're going to have to create a lot of partnerships and learn to talk to each other in a way we haven't done in the past. We are not interested in moving into the distribution system at all. What we are interested in is understanding and being able to understand what's happening on the distribution system so we can arrange our planning accordingly. And that's where visibility and communication really come up. So visibility, as we define it, is MISO's ability to maintain our situational awareness of what is going to happen at the transmission level. So our ability to maintain reliability is based on understanding the impact of power flow at the transmission level. As we see more dynamic growth on the distribution system, we'll see differences in power flow at the transmission level, and we want to be sure we understand that to maintain that situational awareness and reliability. We may use statistical methods to forecast what's happening on assets that are on the distribution system. For example, a lot of the DER that's installed is solar. We've heard the story of solar today as folks have worked through kind of the industrial scale queue, the residential queue, or any distribution queues set up at a state level will show very similar results. There's a lot of solar being added. So understanding from what the solar performance might be and understanding simply just how many panels are out there without much more information can still help us assess what might be happening from a load masking standpoint, meaning that the load would be there, people would be using power that we could see, except they're generating locally on site. So when they do that, that changes our load forecast. And again, our load forecast, as you've heard multiple times today, is critically important to us to understand to make sure we have enough generation online and generation in the stack. So we may do some sort of statistical analysis based on what we think is out there, but we'd also like to communicate with some assets potentially on the distribution system. And again, this is based on market participation. So if there are assets that sit on the distribution system and would like to participate in the wholesale market, that's entirely up to the state. That's up to the state regulators to determine whether or not that participation would be accessible, with the exception of the ESR in Order 841. Folks have referred to the Order 841 previously. Energy storage resources have been given a FERC order that says if they are located on the distribution system, they need to have access to the wholesale market. So that's really kind of the first test balloon, so to speak, of distribution level assets that would be communicating or able to participate in the wholesale market. And that coordination is going to take some work for us to figure that out. We need to talk to our distribution utilities when it comes to those assets to make sure that we understand their needs in terms of worker safety. For example, if there are signals being sent to something from the wholesale market, but we don't have much other information about what might be going on in the distribution system, how do we coordinate those activities to ensure that we remain reliable on the distribution system and the transmission system, but also maintain safety? And we know that that's very important to the distribution members. We don't want to do anything that contravenes what they need to do in order to maintain reliability on their system. So we're looking to start talking about that with our stakeholders this fall. The ESR function of the 841 order isn't put fully in place until June of 2022. So we're well in advance of when we might have the first thing participate in our market. But we want to start that conversation this fall and start talking about communicating with those kinds of assets. And then I will make a quick plug for our upcoming visibility report. So MISO has been working again with their stakeholders. We've also talked to a lot of good outside vendors about what they're doing with communication in other parts of the country, other parts of Europe and Australia where they see a lot of DER, to get a better understanding of what is coming from MISO. And we've put together some ideas about our thoughts on visibility and communication that we intend to publish. This is not a solutions paper, so this is not something we plan to put out there that's a solution. It's really the beginning of a conversation, saying here are some of the things we've considered And then that will start a series of conversations with our stakeholders as we continue to see DER growth in our footprint. That's all. And to everyone else's point, I will stop sharing my screen and I'll be online for questions.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Doug, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me just ask for confirmation if folks can both see my screen and hear me. Doug, can you in fact see both?
I can
Great.
see and hear.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry, one second. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity. If you were with us earlier this morning, I spoke on resource adequacy. Again, my name is Tim Burtis with PJM. I'm presently the manager of our State Policy Solutions Group. Worked at PJM a little bit over 15 years here in various engineering roles in markets and operations. And I'm now over in our State Government Policy Group and have been effectively for the last 5 years or so. So thank you for the opportunity. Also, thank you to Kristen for opening up this discussion. I think you're going to hear a lot of parallels between what Kristen has said and how things are going in MISO, as well as how they're going in PJM with respect to both DERs as well as electric vehicles. So I'll just go ahead and hop into it right now. There we go. Okay, so at PJM, we really have sort of a three-phase strategy for distributed energy resource. And you heard Kristen mention a little bit of this earlier with MISO as well. It first starts with visibility, trying to understand what it is that is actually on the distribution system, or at least behind the wholesale meter. And I'll talk about why that's different in a minute. But it's trying to get visibility into how these resources can affect our load patterns. Because at the end of the day, obviously, this impacts infrastructure investment in very costly, either be it generation and capacity or over on the transmission infrastructure side. So having visibility into these DERs really help us with the next phase, which is then once we know where these things are at, we can have some situational awareness to them, we can then forecast and measure and factor them into our resource adequacy requirements and factor them into our transmission planning requirements, the regional transmission expansion plan. And so that's visibility and forecast and measurement are kind of your no regrets approach to PJM being involved in understanding where these DERs are located at, because again, it improves the operational situational awareness for PJM, and it has the corollary benefit to consumers. These things are already on the system, they already exist, so we may as well factor them in a way that is going to be beneficial for reflecting minimized cost expenditures. So visibility, forecast, measurement, again, sort of your no regrets approach. The third area is an area to incent, and this is can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and this is an opportunity that to the extent states, because states oversee these DERs, distributed energy resources, want to encourage their participation in the wholesale electricity market, say through aggregation, PJM will have a structure to allow for that. That would be the third leg of the strategy. And it's kind of akin to how PJM interacts with the states on demand response or energy efficiency right now. So in most of your traditionally regulated states, demand response can only come into the wholesale marketplace if it comes in through the local electric distribution company. In your retail choice states that are also in PJM, it's more third party can go out, they can sign up demand response customers who want to curtail, and then they can bring them into the marketplace themselves. So that's generally how this would probably look from an incentive standpoint, is that it would really be reflective upon the state model and how they would like DERs to participate, but that is a little bit farther down the road. So taking a look at each one of these individually, let's look at visibility. So a couple of years ago, PJM embarked on initiating a survey with our transmission owning partners, as well as with state utility commissions and other EDCs on the system, as well as other sources of data like EIA and what have you. So what we want to do is on a periodic basis, make sure that we have an understanding about how much DER is actually out there on the system. And we have classified our DERs really in two buckets. We call them non-retail and retail, not to be confused with wholesale, which is a completely different animal altogether. So wholesale is sort of your PJM level generator. Retail is just that. It's sitting on the customer meter. Think of it as a diesel generator at a hospital. Think of it as solar PV on a home, right? That's your retail. Non-retail is this more squishy category where the generator itself may either be partially participating in a PJM market and partially serving its own demand, and we don't have visibility into that part that serves its own demand. A lot of PURPA units old PURPA units are kind of like this. Another example of a non-retail resource would be a generator sitting at a municipal that's behind the wholesale meter of the transmission owner. PJM wouldn't have visibility into that resource. It's not a wholesale generator, but it certainly can affect municipal demand going out throughout the system. So the upshot here is this is the breakdown of where we're at. It's a little bit over just around 7,000 megawatts or so of DERs on the PJM system. You see the breakdown. Non-retail is if it's solar or non-solar. We only look at things that are above 1 megawatt, excuse me, on the non-retail side. And then on the retail side, we try to get as much visibility as we can all the way down to below 1 megawatt, because we do have a good understanding about where some of this solar is located at. So what do we do with this information from a visibility standpoint? Well, if the information, if the generator itself is greater than or equal to 1 megawatt, what we want to do is we want to add it to our dispatch maps for our dispatchers. We'll talk about what that means in a second. We also include it in our post-contingency local load relief warning reports. And this is if PJM is experiencing an incident where one more contingency happens, we would have to call upon the TO to implement a localized load shed. Being able to include these DER resources would in fact help inform us of alternatives that would exist instead of having to go to that warning scenario. If the DER resources are greater than or equal to 10 megawatts, and particularly they're dispatchable, we want to put them into our EMS model, because we believe that at that level, they could have operational impacts that we would want to have the real-time visibility into. And because of that, we'd like to obtain some real-time telemetry to the extent that we find that possible. So that's really what we want to do with the information once we end up having the visibility, so we can rope it into at least our operational processes. As part of that, we've created this DER directory. So the survey itself is great that we have it, but what do you do with that information once you have it, and how can it get updated with some level of official process? We have a DER directory where the TOs or the EDCs may be able to actually go ahead and implement or upload these DERs themselves, so that we can factor this in a more systematic process for the visibility aspects. I talked about our dispatch map. So this is what we call DIMA, the Dispatch Interactive Mapping Application. And so what we do with this map, this is something that the PJM dispatchers have, and on a zip code level basis, we provide how much DER, and the DER specifically, that's at that particular zip code, as well as any dispatchable demand response. And what it allows the dispatcher to do is, if we start to see some localized issues, they can actually lasso an area, and up will pop a listing of all the DERs in that area or the dispatchable demand response to provide increased visibility to the dispatcher to give them another tool to utilize outside of our normal SCED processing and generation redispatch. So forecasts and measurements, look, over the last, this slide only goes back, I believe, to 2013. I would say this decline has been in since at least 2010, since the Great Recession has occurred. But what is evident in this slide is that we have seen consistent drops in PJM's load forecast over the last 7 years and probably even closer to the last decade. Now, what is really driving that? Some of it has been the economy, but more importantly and more impactful has been the further deployment of some energy efficiency measures, as well as the proliferation of DERs and their usage over the peak periods of time. This is just an example of what we saw back in 2017 with respect to the solar eclipse. This is just for behind the meter solar. So this is, even though it says PJM solar, this is not the solar that was on the PJM system at the time, but it was behind the meter. And what you see here is that the bright blue line there is what actually came offline when we ran into that eclipse almost exactly 3 years ago. And you see that immediate drop, right? And so obviously this is an exaggeration. You don't have an eclipse happening a lot. But what it demonstrates is the fact that that's the level of resources that could be on the system at any given point in time that could all of a sudden have to pop back up and be producing or be grid consuming resources onto the network. And so I use this to illustrate that point about how over the course of within an hour, resources came off and then they immediately came back up over time. So how do we factor solar into our load forecast? We have a 5-step process. You know, we're observing where the net load is. We gross that out against the non-wholesale solar. We calculate, we do some back casting, and then we add all of that back. We effectively net out where that forecasted then growth of gross load otherwise would be coming. And then that's how we end up getting that green line out there that is attempting to forecast out the gross, the growth of DER solar in particular, so that we're factoring it into our load forecast again, so that we're not inflating our forecasts for things like the capacity market and the RTEP process, the transmission planning process. And so what does this look like on a transmission owner level? Well, these are the transmission owners inside the PJM footprint. And so from 2020 out through the next 15 years, you see the growth of where we see distributed solar in each one of these respective transmission owning zones. And if you were to start here, I would start at this DPL, this green area, and you just go all the way down to PSE&G. For those of you that are familiar with the East Coast, I-95 runs from Maine to Miami, and in the PJM territory, it runs from northern New Jersey down to Richmond. And it is obviously a very congested area. Well, DPL down to PSE&G is all of that I-95 corridor, and it's highly congested from a population density standpoint, so it's also highly congested from a transmission congestion perspective. And what we see is that, you know, a large amount of the forecasted solar is to come in that I-95 corridor here at PJM. It's a great thing from a congestion standpoint. It's a great thing from being able to reduce costs to consumers with respect to transmission planning and capacity. The challenge is that all that solar is also going to be localized. So if there's cloud shears that come in, it's going to cover, you know, that same similar region. So that's something we do want to think about as we start talking about operations and market products like fast ramping capability and stuff like that as a result of this concentrated penetration of DERs. But this is what we're first trying to do to get the visibility about where we even see it and where we could see potential operational problems emerge. Okay, and finally with the incent, PJM does allow some distributed resources to participate in the market today through our regulation markets. They can aggregate up, so you can have one representative bring forward hundreds of water heaters, for instance, or different low-level batteries that aren't participating at the wholesale market. and they can actually engage and provide frequency response regulation service. And so in the case of PJM and where we're at today, about 120 just energy storage behind the meter resources are qualified and eligible to participate in the frequency regulation market. And you see over on the left-hand side where they've been at in terms of being able to have average monthly revenues back, at least in 2018. So where do we go with here with respect to storage and storage as a distribution resource? Well, we also want to look at storage as a transmission asset, and this is an area that is picking up more and more. I know MISO is looking at this. I've kind of pivoted from general distributed energy resources to something more specific around storage over the last two slides with regulation, and now looking at storage as a resource, as a transmission asset. But I bring it up because I do think it's an important front that we're gonna see in the DER space and how it plays itself out. And DER storage right now is a distributed asset and is recovering rate base in some locales. So we want to look at that area and see all of these different puzzle pieces and how they fit together and can be used at the transmission level. Okay. I'll briefly touch base about what we're doing now with the electric vehicle front and how we're looking at electric vehicles, similarly from a visibility and a forecasting and measurement standpoint. And so from the approach, this is an outline of the approach and what we're doing, but effectively how we're trying to get solid visibility into the electric vehicle market inside the PJM footprint. So we're looking at, what's actually registered with the states in PJM, what are the sales that are occurring in different census regions, so we can track that to our load forecasting. Obviously, the PJM share of a given state population, what vehicles are being retired and the source of that, and so on and so forth. So a bunch of different inputs that are coming in to help inform our visibility into an estimate for EV adoption. And then what we do is we try to put that out into, okay, so what, right? So at least from a load forecasting standpoint, we want to care about how many of these things are going to be connected up to the grid and actually charging themselves at the peak hour, because that's what we're using to inform our resource adequacy requirements and inform our RTEP requirements. And so this is a slide that looks out again over that same 2035 year horizon, and where we see across the PJM footprint, just the peak hour, just the megawatts of peak hour, you're looking at about 1,500 megawatts of additional load coming on to charge at the peak. Now, why is that low? Our peak hour tends to hit across the region between about 4 in the afternoon and 6 to 6:30 in the evening. That also tends to be rush hour, absent COVID and quarantine periods. So admittedly, that may change some things. But where we're at today is this is the peak period of what we see, and we would envision most of these road resources being on the road over the period of time during rush hour of peak period. This is that forecast that we've done for EVs over time, at peak charging period, and where we've been over the last several years with our forecast. What you see is a relatively large jump from 2019 to 2020. So that's the blue line there versus the green line. Really three contributors to that. Number one is the cost of EVs themselves have dropped year over year for our analysis. An increase in state and federal policies has helped promote EV adoption by our forecasts. And then finally has been advances in the battery life themselves. And those advances, what they're able to do is really bring down what's termed range anxiety. So you can get more than 50 miles to a battery charge. That's going to promote EV adoption among people more and more over the out years of the period. So that's why we've had that jump over year to year in our forecast. And then finally, this is just an additional graphic that just shows that same information of charging load relative to where we're at with solar. So I'll dispense with that. And with that, I thank you all for the time. turn it back to you, Doug.
Thank you, Tim. I'm not seeing any questions on the YouTube chat. I don't know if any have come into the email, but I'll start out with a question for Kristen. You mentioned that MISO gets information regarding the existing DER from the OMS survey. Could you speak a little bit more about what level of detail that might provide in terms of, is it aggregate at the utility level? Do you get location and size specific information and so forth?
We get none of those details. So we get a number, and the number includes some information about the type of generation. So what is solar, what is diesel, there's all kinds of generation types out there. Solar being the biggest piece of what we've gotten. We get no locational information. In part, that's because of privacy. So OMS has kind of indicated if only one respondent responds in Michigan, we don't want to indicate to you who that was inadvertently. So we don't get information by location. And this is the third year of this survey, I would note. So the first year, the response rate was much lower. Last year, the response rate covered about 80% of MISO load, much, much better. And then this year, the response rate was also very good. It's in any new survey process, it takes people a little while to get used to it and figure out how to respond. So I know that the response this year was pretty robust, but we get generation type, but not any information on location, nothing by utility, nothing that's identifiable to the respondent.
Thank you. So, Tim, you provided some forecasts in terms of DER and PEV looking into the future. Could you speak a little bit about how you guys produce those forecasts, what drives them, so forth?
Yeah, sure. And, Tom Fallon is the gentleman who's really responsible for that part of the organization that produces these, and I think he's on the line. But so Tom can set me straight where I've missed anything. But at least from a DER standpoint, obviously we take the information that we already have today from the surveys that have been conducted and DERs that are added. We're able to use an input of resources that are qualified and set up in renewable attribute tracking systems within the PJM states. So that's a nice form of insight into distributed energy resources as well. We also contract with a particular economic forecaster, a consultant that looks at the information from a policy perspective, an adoption rate perspective, and goes down into the TEO census level area with respect to PV adoption and how we can forecast that out over time. And we engage with our stakeholders over the summer through our load forecast subcommittee as we have that back and forth with the consultant and as our staff is able to develop what looks like a robust and what I'll call rational forecast of the future of PV adoption.
Okay, thank you. I see there's a question coming out of the chat, but I'll ask one more question as the moderator's prerogative before I go to that. Kristen, could you speak to what MISO is doing in terms of forecasting of DERs and PEVs, or what they may be planning on doing going forward?
So I think my answer will sound a lot like Tim's in that we also contract with a third party who assembles information from a variety of sources when we look at our transmission expansion plan futures. So in our transmission futures, we have an estimate of DER that we would expect to see growing across the footprint. We have not formalized any other method of forecasting DER expansion. So we're investigating what we can do. took a little picture, Tim, of your awesome chart by your locatory entities or by your utilities. And I said, hey guys, could we create this chart to our team? So we're still working on the best ways to capture that information. We do comb through IRPs. We do take a look at what our member plans are and ideally try to separate out when they have any available information on whether those would be distribution or transmission level asset investments. For example, you know, if they just say we're adding 3,000 megawatts of solar, I can't tell you whether or not that will be on the distribution system or the transmission system. So some of it undoubtedly will be in both places. And we haven't landed on a good formalized way for us to make an estimate that isn't just collecting data from a variety of sources and trying to cobble them together and say, this is sort of the picture we think we might see in the future. We would like to improve that significantly. It's a big piece of what I consider to be visibility for MISO. But I also think states are still coming up that education chain, right, in terms of what they see for, some states do have, ask their utilities to put together distribution queues to show exactly what's in queue potentially on the distribution system. Some states are starting to move toward more distribution resource planning, so integrated planning for their distribution systems as well. Not every state has that yet. So I think that is a maturing topic across the DER landscape for lots of states. Topic across the DER landscape for lots of states.
Okay. Thank you. I'll move on to a couple of questions in the queue here. This is from Steve Francis. Do you think an overemphasis on reliability by a state legislature or planning organization could negatively impact the deployment of DER and wind and solar generation? Do we have anybody volunteer to tackle that to start?
Could you repeat the question, Doug? I didn't quite get the first. Thank you.
Do you think an overemphasis on reliability by a state legislature or planning organization could negatively impact the deployment of DER and wind and solar generation?
Yeah, I think my short answer, and sorry, because I'll hop in and at least take a first shot at it, but I think my short answer is yes, you could, right? So you always hear about barriers to entry with all sorts of new technologies, and I think that, you know, if you were to just look at, you know, storage as a transmission asset, for instance, right, you could put in all sorts of reliability criteria that would preclude that from happening. And so the balance always is trying to make sure that you're meeting the bare minimum requirements of reliability in order to incent the right value or the right type of technology to come on without being overly burdensome. That being said, where's that line and how do you do it? You know, it's certainly challenging, and I think, you know, from PJM as somebody who spoke a few panels ago on the resource adequacy construct, capacity in PJM is a reliability product. And it is something that you are committing to provide based on your historical performance and based on what you are expected to be able to put out. But intermittent resources, DERs, right, storage resources, they are calculated in a different manner than your traditional thermal resources. And so that's the question of like, well, is that overemphasis on reliability, or is that a properly defined product that you've put in PJM with capacity? And that's always the tension that we see. And I think if you're a thermal generator, you think it's just fine. I think if you're an advanced technology resource who wants to come in, you're saying, well, you know, maybe you're being a little bit overly burdensome. And, you know, that's why we have the stakeholder process at PJM to help, you know, sort of balance some of those interests out. But
I think I would echo a lot of what Tim said. I think that, yes, there's the potential to put those barriers to entry in. I think one of the more interesting stakeholder conversations, and we just recently had a presentation on this, has been about the concept of how we determine what the grid needs. So Melissa spoke this morning about the reliability imperative, trying to identify what exactly and PJM did as well, spoke about how do we how do we categorize assets in terms of what they can provide in terms of grid services, and really be somewhat agnostic as to where those services come from, but to say, here's what we need for the services, here's how we've built that into our market, and here's how you can be compensated for providing it. And so in doing that, I think you would open up potentially the possibility for DER to provide some services that they don't traditionally provide today, or we haven't had much experience with yet. For wind and solar, somewhat similarly, especially this becomes an interesting conversation as soon as you start talking about hybrids, because you start saying, well, if I can put 4 types of assets in somewhat the same rough location or same point of interconnection, why can't I just be treated like a power plant, right? So I know that that's a conversation that's out there in the industry, and it's a very interesting one, I think. And I think it's going to take a lot of stakeholder collaboration, as Tim said, right? That's largely a stakeholder conversation, is what can you provide? Do we provide products that meet what you can provide? How do we develop those products if needed? But ensure from our side, here are the attributes we need to see to maintain reliability, and we need those met. I don't think we have an opinion on how they get met, but we need these things met, right? And so I think partnering with the state so that we have the same understanding of those needs is probably really, really critical, so that the state isn't doing something or not doing something inadvertently that doesn't necessarily support that kind of common vision. I think we have a common vision to ensure reliability. So how do we work together to make sure that we're using the same metrics in terms of what will lead to reliability?
We have one more question from Mike Mullet. This is a question for both Kristen and Tim. What is the perspective on aggregators and the role they will play in the ESR space going forward? What about solar plus storage plus aggregation?
So I think there's no question that aggregation will be necessary for larger wholesale market participation. We see that now in other markets around the world where they take smaller assets, they group them together and then offer them in. That's been a tried and true method in other ISOs and other RTOs. It's also something that we know FERC is investigating. They've had the technical conferences on aggregation and possibly have a sort of a partially written order sitting out there that might come our way one day. But I think aggregation of DER to participate in the wholesale market is unquestionably part of the future. The minimum size threshold of being only 100 kilowatts for the Order 841 was an important, I think, threshold determination. It really changes kind of what we think of when we think of wholesale market assets. And so I think it's a developing story. Tim, I don't know what you think as well, so.
No, I think that was very well said, Kristen. I don't have much to add otherwise, but I mean, really, I do think that aggregators play a significant role, if for nothing else, being able to be the front lines to coalesce some of that data and bring it into the marketplace. You know, we are not equipped, you know, working at the wholesale level to be able to handle across 14 jurisdictions what would otherwise be thousands and thousands of assets, and have the computing power to be able to do that, and then put that into our EMS, put that into our SCED. And so the role that aggregators can play is hugely important, and it provides some optionality for them as well when you know, one resource may not be available or may not be able to do something. They haven't overcommitted themselves with a single asset, but they can backfill that with something else in their portfolio that is very similarly situated. So yeah, no, aggregators will play a very big role, and they've done it with demand response and PJM thus far.
Well, we seem to be out of questions on the chat. I don't know if there are any on email.
We do not at this time.
Okay. We can give it a minute or two, or I would say we could let people go home early, but I think most people are already home. So
Well, while we're waiting for
you, Brad.
Hey, all right. Well, we'll see if some other questions come in, but definitely I want to get this in before we take and call it a day. I want to thank all the speakers, of course, for some excellent presentations. And other than YouTube letting us down earlier this morning, and some problems with our computer or my computer on this end for a little while, things have gone very well. So hopefully that bodes well if we have to do this in the future. One thing I would like to let everyone know is that we are going to have yet another contemporary issues IRP workshop on September 24th. So again, it's only 4 weeks away or so. We will have another workshop. The way this was originally set up, we were supposed to have this conference in March or April, latest May, and then this other one was going to be August or September. But we are stuck with having to do it in the August, September timeframe, the second one. And it is going to be done by Lawrence Berkeley Labs. We have been working with them, and we're going to be looking at it's going to be a kind of a broad ranging conversation. It's going to be looking at the integration of distribution system planning with IRP and even RTO planning. And then it's going to be part of it will be looking at the load shapes and impacts on avoided cost for EE and different types of DERs, and then how they interact with each other and the impact of avoided cost. So again, that will be on September 24th, and what we will be doing is sending out information on that here probably in the not too distant future. And I don't know if we're going to do it this way or if LBNL wants to do it a different way, because they will be doing all of the speaking for the most part, unless we invite 1 or 2 other people to speak as well. But they're going to be doing most of the heavy lifting, so they may have a different technology that they want to use. But more on that in the very near future. And there is one question that just came in from Mike Mullet. If Kristen and Tim are still available to respond, it is how will aggregators be classified? Will they be QFs or something else?
So in the MISO market, an aggregator of retail customers can participate in multiple products. And so they can aggregate together, for example, demand response products and participate in the capacity market. They can aggregate demand response products right now and participate as a dispatchable, it's a demand response DRR. It's a DRR product, demand response resource product, and they can aggregate a number of things together. But the aggregator of retail customers is defined within a FERC order. And so that established how they were classified in terms of aggregating those customers together. Now that was the FERC order on demand response, but in terms of how they're classified, I would say that to the best of my understanding, they're market participants, but I'm not anticipating something very different than that. I'm not exactly sure about the kind of genesis of that question in that way. Tim, is there something else I'm missing here?
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, from PJM's standpoint, and very similar participation as in MISO, they would participate as market participants. From our standpoint, they come in like another supplier sector, and then they just have the opportunity to have access into the market. So we don't, delineate between being a QF or otherwise.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Doug, did you have anything more, or are you done?
I have nothing further.
Okay, well, not seeing any questions. I guess one thing I will say is you can, if you have any additional questions that you want to ask, and we can try to get responses from the speakers if you designate the exact topic that you're aiming it at, the question at, if you shoot those questions to Bob Pauly's email, which we discussed earlier and was also put on the live chat earlier today. We can do that, and then we'll try to post the answers to any questions that we get on our website. So I don't know if Chairman Houston, if you wanted to say anything to close this out.
Well, I love starting off with a thank you, and I love closing with a thank you. Kristen, Doug, Tim, thank you very much for this very thoughtful presentation. And to PJM and MISO, thank you for participating in this full day contemporary issues seminar. We are living through very, very dynamic period of time. And this forum provides us update opportunity, not only for the commission, but as you know, for over 100 stakeholders that were on the line with us today across the state and some around the country as well. So to the leadership at PJM and MISO, thank you for allowing all of your teams to participate in this way. And just as Brad said, we originally had planned this thing in March, and then it was going to move to April, then it was going to be May. COVID-19 has had an interruptive force in the way that we were putting this thing together, but we're also learning and obviously walk through some of these technical problems as well. So on behalf of myself and my fellow commissioners, thank you very much for participating. I wish good health and safety to everybody and look forward to working with you guys on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Well, thank you and have a good rest of the day.